A 6-year-old boy walked into a diner full of 77 outlaw bikers during the worst snowstorm Black Creek had seen in 40 years. He had a hospital wristband on his wrist, coins in his frozen fingers, and no adult anywhere behind him. He asked for soup. What happened next would uncover a web of corruption so deep it reached into the county sheriff's department, the foster care system, and the grave of a dead man whose last words were a promise no one kept. One deputy wanted that boy to disappear. 77 men in leather made sure he didn't. But protection comes with a price, and not everyone in that diner would survive what was coming. If this story satisfies something deep inside of you, hit that subscribe button right now. Drop a like. And tell me in the comments where you're watching from tonight. I want to know which city, which state, which country is riding with us. Stay until the very end. Trust me. You don't want to miss what happens in part 5. The storm didn't arrive. It detonated. February in Black Creek, West Virginia meant cold that crawled into your chest and stayed there like a debt you couldn't pay. But this wasn't ordinary winter. This was the kind of weather that killed livestock, cracked pipes inside walls, and made the 11 o'clock news use words like historic and unprecedented, while anchors sat warm behind studio glass. By 8 p.m., Route 19 was a burial ground of jackknifed semis and abandoned sedans, half swallowed by drifts. County dispatch stopped answering non-emergency calls at 7. The power grid flickered twice before 9 and never fully committed to staying on. And through all of it, 77 Harley-Davidsons growled through the whiteout like a pack of wolves that refused to die. The Iron Sentinels Motorcycle Club had been riding south from a memorial run in Pennsylvania when the storm caught them on open highway with nowhere to go but forward. Their president, Mason Vale, rode point with ice forming on his beard and visibility down to 15 feet of swirling white nothing. He was 44 years old, built like a man who'd been hit by life more times than he'd been hugged by it, and he hadn't slept in 31 hours. His left knee ached from a combat injury he never talked about. His right hand was missing the tip of its ring finger from a machine shop accident. He talked about too much, usually after whiskey, usually to women who didn't stay. Mason wasn't a good man. He knew that. He'd broken bones that didn't need breaking. He'd made promises he couldn't keep. He'd buried a brother 6 years ago and walked away from the family he swore to protect because grief was easier to carry than responsibility. That last part was the wound that never closed. Rustline Diner appeared through the snow like a hallucination. Yellow neon bleeding through white static, a flat-roofed cinder-block rectangle squatting beside Route 19 with a gravel lot barely visible beneath the accumulation. Mason raised his fist. 77 engines dropped from thunder to idle, the lot filled with machines and men, and the sound of boots hitting frozen ground while exhaust smoke mixed with snowfall in the parking lot lights. Inside, the diner smelled like burnt coffee, bacon grease, and the particular exhaustion of a place that had been open too long with too few customers. Donna Briggs, the owner, was 62 and looked 70. She stood behind the counter with a pot in each hand, regular and decaf, watching leather-clad men file through her door like an invasion she hadn't been briefed on. Her eyes went wide. Her mouth went tight. She didn't say welcome. "We need coffee," Mason said, snow still melting in his beard. "And whatever food you've got, we'll pay double." Donna looked at him, looked past him at the parade of cuts and tattoos and road-worn faces, filling every booth and counter stool in the place. One of her waitresses, a girl barely 20, had already backed into the kitchen and wasn't coming out. "Cash," Donna said. "Cash," Mason confirmed. She poured the first cup without another word. The Sentinels settled in the way large groups of dangerous men settle anywhere. Not loudly, not violently, but with a gravity that rearranged the room around them. Conversations were low, laughter was rare. Most of them sat with their backs to walls and their eyes on doors, because that was how you survived long enough to get old in this life. Tank, the sergeant-at-arms, took a corner booth and spread his massive frame across the vinyl seat like a man who expected the world to make room for him. Sky, the club's intelligence officer, and the only woman at the table wearing a full-patch cut, sat near the register, running weather reports on her phone with the calm efficiency of someone who'd spent 12 years in military signals intelligence before trading one brotherhood for another. Nobody in that diner knew what was about to walk through the door. The bell above the entrance rang at 9:47 p.m. Mason saw the draft first, a gust of snow and frozen air that cut through the warmth like a blade. Then he saw the shape. Small. Wrong. A silhouette that didn't belong in a doorway during a storm that had shut down the entire county. A boy. 6 years old, maybe less. Hoodie so thin it might as well have been paper. No coat, no gloves, no hat. Red fingers curled around something he held against his chest like a secret. Snow clung to his hair and his eyelashes, and the hospital wristband dangling from his left wrist. White plastic with black text that Mason couldn't read from across the room, but couldn't stop staring at. The boy stood in the doorway and looked at 77 bikers the way a deer looks at headlights. Frozen, terrified, calculating whether to run. Nobody moved. Not Donna, not Tank, not Sky, not the cook watching through the kitchen window, not a single one of the hardest men in 3 states. The boy walked to the counter. His sneakers were soaked through. They left wet prints on the linoleum that looked like evidence of something gone terribly wrong. He reached the counter and stood on his toes and opened his hand. Coins. A crumpled dollar bill and a scatter of change. "I have $1.37, the boy whispered. His voice was barely there. A ghost of a voice. "Is that enough for soup?" Mason felt something crack inside his chest. Not break. Crack. The way ice cracks on a river before the whole surface gives way. He set down his coffee. He didn't breathe. Donna stared at the child. Her hard face did something it probably hadn't done in years. It softened. She opened her mouth, but nothing came out. Sky was already moving. She crossed the diner in 4 strides, crouched beside the boy, and looked at his hands. Red. Near frostbitten. She looked at his sneakers. Soaked. She looked at his hoodie, damp and inadequate and hanging off a frame that was too thin for any 6-year-old anywhere. "Where's your mom, sweetheart?" Sky asked, keeping her voice low and level. Military training, calm the subject first. The boy didn't answer. He just held his coins tighter. Mason stood. The stool scraped against the floor and the sound cut through the silence like a gunshot. He walked to the counter and crouched beside Sky, and that's when he saw it. The wristband. Harper, Eli. Age 6. County General Hospital. Admitted 0211. Discharged 0214. Harper. The name hit Mason like a fist he didn't see coming. His vision tunneled. The diner noise, what little there was, dropped to nothing. He was somewhere else suddenly, 6 years back. A hospital room that smelled like antiseptic and failure. A man named Caleb Harper lying in a bed with tubes in his arms and monitors counting down the seconds of his life, gripping Mason's hand with whatever strength the dying man could muster. "My family, Mays, you take care of my family." "I will, brother. I swear." He didn't. Caleb died. Mason rode away. The grief was easier to carry when he didn't have to look at what he'd left behind. He told himself Lena would manage. Told himself the club's benevolence fund would cover the bills. Told himself someone else would step up, because Mason Vale was good at riding and fighting and drinking, but not at being the kind of man who showed up when showing up was the hardest part. Now Caleb's son stood in front of him with frozen hands and $1.37 and a question about soup. "Get him whatever he wants," Mason told Donna. His voice was gravel and glass. "Put it on me." "Mister," the boy said, looking up with eyes that were too old for his face, "I can pay." "I know you can. But you don't have to." Something flickered behind those eyes. Not trust. Not yet. Something closer to confusion. The look of a child who wasn't used to hearing that he didn't have to do things alone. Donna brought soup. Chicken noodle, steaming. The boy ate like he hadn't eaten in days, fast, protective, one arm curled around the bowl like someone might take it. Tank watched from his corner booth with an expression that could have been carved from granite, except for the muscle working in his jaw. 3 seats down, a prospect named Decker quietly wiped his eyes with the back of his hand and pretended he hadn't. Sky sat beside the boy and waited. She didn't push. She didn't ask again. She just sat there, a presence, the way you sit beside something fragile when you know that pressure will shatter it. After the 3rd spoonful, the boy spoke. "My mom's sick," he said. "Where is she?" Sky asked. "The motel, room 12. She told me to stay, but she couldn't wake up and I got scared." Mason's blood went cold. "Couldn't wake up?" "She was breathing. Eli said quickly, as if he'd checked. As if checking whether his mother was alive was something he'd learned to do. But she wouldn't open her eyes, and the medicine was all gone. Sky looked at Mason. Mason looked at Sky. The translation happened without words. A sick mother. An empty medicine supply. A 6-year-old walking through a lethal snowstorm to buy soup with pocket change because he was afraid his mother was dying and didn't know what else to do. "Which motel?" Mason asked. "Sunrise, down the road." Mason knew the Sunrise Motel. Everyone in Black Creek knew the Sunrise Motel. It was the kind of place where people ended up when every other option had already said no. A strip of 12 rooms with thin walls, thinner doors, and a parking lot that collected police cruisers the way other lots collected shopping carts. The county used it as overflow housing for CPS cases, parolees, and anyone else the system needed to store but didn't want to spend money on. It was also where Deputy Warren Rohr liked to make his rounds. Mason stood. "Tank. Sky. With me." "In this storm?" Tank said, not refusing, measuring. "That boy walked a mile in it. We can drive 3 blocks. Tank finished his coffee in one swallow and stood. The booth creaked in relief. Mason crouched in front of Eli. "We're going to go check on your mom. You're going to stay here where it's warm. Donna's going to keep that soup coming, okay?" The boy studied Mason's face with the intensity of someone who'd learned early that adults lied. "You're coming back?" "Yeah. People say that." The sentence landed like a knife in Mason's sternum. He held the boy's gaze and said nothing for a 3 count because he understood, viscerally, in the marrow of his bones, that this child had been abandoned so many times the word promise meant nothing to him anymore. "I'm coming back," Mason said. "And if I don't, every man in this room will come find you. That's not a promise. That's 77 of them." Eli looked around the diner at the leather and the tattoos and the scarred faces watching him with an attention that had nothing to do with pity and everything to do with something they probably couldn't name themselves. "Okay," the boy said. Mason, Tank, and Sky pushed out into the storm. The Sunrise Motel sat 3 blocks east on a frontage road that ran parallel to Route 19 like its uglier, forgotten sibling. Red neon from the vacancy sign bled through the snowfall and painted everything in the parking lot the color of a wound. Half the room numbers had fallen off their doors. A vending machine near the office flickered with a dying fluorescent bulb that buzzed loud enough to hear over the wind. Room 12 was at the end of the row. The door was unlocked. Mason pushed it open and the smell hit him first. Stale air, fever sweat, and something chemical underneath it all, like expired medication and unwashed sheets, and the particular odor of a body fighting to survive with no resources left to fight with. Lena Harper lay on the bed closest to the wall. She was 31 but looked 45. Her skin was gray. Her breathing was shallow and irregular, the kind of breathing you heard in field hospitals when a body was running out of reasons to keep going. Bruises marked her arms in patterns that weren't accidental. Her sleeves had ridden up, revealing the purple and yellow map of someone else's hands. "Someone's been hitting her," Sky said, quiet as a blade. Mason didn't respond. "I was looking at the nightstand. 3 empty prescription bottles. A county hospital discharge form dated 6 days ago. A child's drawing taped to the lamp. Stick figures, 2 of them, one small and one tall. Both smiling, both standing in front of a house that didn't exist." Tank checked the bathroom. Empty. He came back shaking his head. "She needs a hospital," Sky said, 2 fingers on Lena's wrist. "Pulse is there, but it's weak. Fever's high. I don't know what medication she was on or how long she's been without them, but this isn't just the flu, Mason. This woman is shutting down." Mason pulled out his phone. No signal. The storm had eaten the cell towers along with everything else. He moved to the motel's landline on the desk between the beds. Dead. He tried the front office. Locked. Dark. The manager had evacuated or simply stopped caring, both equally likely at the Sunrise. "Tank, go back to the diner. Use Donna's phone. Call 911. Tank moved. The door banged shut behind him, and the room felt smaller without him in it. Mason stood beside the bed and looked down at Lena Harper and saw the wreckage of a promise he never kept. This woman had been Caleb's world. She'd been strong once. Mason remembered that. Sharp-witted and stubborn and capable of making Caleb laugh until his eyes watered, which was no small feat because Caleb Harper had been one of the most serious men the Iron Sentinels ever patched in. But whatever had happened in the 6 years since Caleb's death had ground Lena down to almost nothing. The bruises, the motel, the empty medicine bottles, the 6-year-old son buying soup in a blizzard. Every one of those failures had Mason's fingerprints on it. Skye looked at him. "You know her." It wasn't a question. "Caleb Harper's wife," Mason said. "Caleb was a sentinel, died 6 years ago, liver failure. I was supposed to look after them." Skye didn't say what she was thinking. She didn't need to. The room said it for her. Headlights swept through the window. Not Tank coming back. The angle was wrong. Mason stepped to the curtain and looked out. A county sheriff's cruiser sat in the parking lot, engine running, wipers pushing snow off the windshield in slow mechanical arcs. The light bar wasn't on, but the driver's side spotlight was, aimed directly at room 12's door. Deputy Warren Rohr stepped out. Mason had never met the man, but he knew the type instantly. Clean uniform despite the storm, hat squared, boots polished. Everything about him arranged and intentional, the way men who liked control arranged themselves because appearance was the first weapon. He was maybe 35, lean, with the angular face of someone who smiled when smiling served a purpose and never any other time. Rohr crossed the parking lot without hurrying. Snow accumulated on his shoulders, and he didn't brush it off. He reached room 12's door and opened it without knocking. "Lena." The deputy's voice was flat. Not warm, not hostile. The tone of a man addressing property. "We talked about this." Lena's eyes opened. Whatever was left of her consciousness registered the uniform and the voice, and what happened to her face in that moment told Mason everything he needed to know. It wasn't anger, it wasn't relief. It was the expression of an animal that had been caged so long it no longer startled when the cage door opened. She was afraid of him, not surprised, not confused, afraid in the way you're afraid of weather, because it's always coming and you can't stop it. "Where's the boy?" Rohr asked. Lena's mouth moved, but no sound came out. "I asked you a question, Lena. Where's Eli?" Mason stepped out of the shadow by the window. "He's safe." Rohr turned. His eyes found Mason's cut first. The Iron Sentinels patch. The president's flash. Then his face. Something calculated happened behind those eyes. A quick assessment, a filing of information, a decision about how much authority to project. "And you are?" "Passing through. Storm pushed us off the highway, found the boy walking alone in a blizzard, and came to check on his mother." "That's county business," Rohr said. "A sick woman and a wandering child are everybody's business." Rohr smiled. It was the worst kind of smile, the kind that had nothing behind it. "I appreciate the concern, but I've got this handled. Lena and I have an arrangement." "What kind of arrangement involves a 6-year-old in the snow with no coat?" The smile stayed. The eyes didn't. "You should get back to your friends, Mr. Vale." "Mr. Vale. Roads are bad. Wouldn't want anyone getting hurt." The threat was so thin it was almost invisible. Almost. But Mason had spent 20 years reading men who said one thing and meant another, and what Warren Rohr meant was perfectly clear. Leave or there will be consequences I've already planned for. Skye stood from the bedside. "This woman needs an ambulance. Her pulse is thready, she's febrile, and those prescription bottles are empty. Whatever arrangement you have, it doesn't include letting her die." Rohr looked at Skye, the way certain men looked at women who spoke with authority, briefly, dismissively, with a flicker of something ugly beneath the professional mask. "The county has resources for situations like this. I'll make the call myself." "Our man already called 911, Mason said. Something shifted in Rohr's posture, barely perceptible, the way a poker player shifts when a card falls wrong. "That wasn't necessary," Rohr said. "She's unconscious and burning up. It was necessary." Rohr looked at Lena, looked at the empty bottles, looked at Mason. Then he reached for his radio and keyed the mic. "Dispatch, this is Unit 7. Cancel the ambulance request for Sunrise Motel. Situation is under control." Skye's hand closed into a fist at her side. Mason felt something hot and electric climb through his chest. The old violence, the one he'd been carrying since the war. The one that lived in the space between control and catastrophe. He wanted to put this man through the wall. Wanted to feel the drywall crack against Rohr's skull. He didn't. Because men like Rohr wanted that. Men like Rohr built careers on provoking reactions they could use later. One swing at a uniformed officer and the Iron Sentinels became the story. One headline about outlaw bikers assaulting a deputy and Eli Harper disappeared into a system designed to lose children. Mason pulled out his own phone. Still no signal. He looked at Sky. "Diner phone," she said, already moving. "I'll call it in direct to County General and tell them to send the ambulance regardless." She was out the door before Roar could respond. The deputy and the biker stood 3 feet apart in a dying motel room while a woman struggled to breathe between them. Snow hissed against the window. The neon vacancy sign pulsed its red light through the curtain in slow, rhythmic intervals that made the room feel like it had a heartbeat of its own. "You're making a mistake," Roar said quietly. "Wouldn't be my first." "This county has a way of handling its own problems, Mr. Vale. Outsiders complicate things." "I'm not an outsider. I'm a man standing next to a woman who needs a hospital." Roar studied him. Something passed behind those dead calm eyes. Not fear, not yet, but the recognition that this situation had developed variables he hadn't planned for. 77 variables, specifically, sitting 3 blocks away in a diner, drinking coffee, and waiting. "We'll see," Roar said. Ambulance lights appeared through the snow 17 minutes later. Roar tried to intercept the paramedics in the parking lot. Mason heard voices through the thin walls. The deputy's calm authority, a paramedic's confused hesitation, then Sky's voice cutting through both of them with clinical precision and a vocabulary that made it clear she knew more about emergency medicine than anyone else in that parking lot. The paramedics came in. They assessed Lena. They loaded her onto a stretcher while Roar watched from the doorway with his arms crossed and his smile finally gone, replaced by something harder and more honest, the expression of a man watching his control slip away in real time. Mason followed the stretcher into the cold. Snow hit his face. Red and white ambulance lights painted the parking lot in alternating pulses. As they loaded Lena into the back, Mason caught her hand. Her eyes opened, barely, just slits of consciousness fighting through fever and exhaustion. "Eli," she breathed. "Where's Eli?" "He's safe. He's warm. He's eating soup." "Don't let him." She gripped Mason's hand with strength that shouldn't have been possible. "Don't let Roar take him. Please. He'll disappear him." The paramedic gently separated their hands. The ambulance doors closed, the siren wound up, and the vehicle pulled out of the lot, and Mason stood in the snow watching the taillights blur into the storm. Disappear him. Not hurt him. Not scare him. Disappear. Mason turned back toward the motel. Roar's cruiser was gone. The parking lot was empty except for tire tracks already filling with fresh snow. The vacancy sign buzzed and flickered. He pulled his collar up and started walking back to the diner, and with every step the weight of Lena's words pressed harder against his chest. This wasn't a custody dispute. This wasn't a difficult situation with a complicated deputy. This was something structured, something planned. A woman beaten into compliance, medicated into dependence, isolated in a dying motel, while a man in a uniform controlled every exit. And Mason had walked away from it 6 years ago. He reached the diner, pushed through the door. 77 faces turned toward him, and he saw in their eyes the thing that made the Iron Sentinels different from every other club on the Eastern Seaboard. Not violence, not loyalty, not brotherhood, but the particular fury of men who recognized injustice because they'd lived inside it. Tank stood near the counter. "Ambulance went?" "Yeah." "The deputy?" "Gone." "What's the play?" Mason looked across the diner at Eli Harper, who sat in a booth with an empty soup bowl and a glass of milk, and Donna's hand on his shoulder, and a blanket someone had found wrapped around his thin frame. The boy was watching Mason with those 2 old eyes, waiting for the verdict the way children wait when they've learned that adults decide their fate in conversations they aren't allowed to hear. "We stay," Mason said. Tank nodded once. Outside, through the frosted glass, a second cruiser had joined the first beneath the streetlight across the road. Then a third. And in room 12 of the Sunrise Motel, the door that Lena Harper had left unlocked hung open in the wind. But it wasn't the wind that would come back for what she left behind. It was something wearing a badge. 3 cruisers now. Mason stood at the diner window with his coffee going cold in his hand and counted them through the frost. 3 county units parked in a loose triangle across Route 19, Engines running, wipers slapping, exhaust clouds rising white against the dark. No lights, no sirens, just presence. The kind of presence that said, "We know where you are, and we're not leaving." Behind him, the diner breathed with the low murmur of 77 men pretending to be calm. Forks scraped plates. Someone coughed. A lighter clicked and a flame appeared in Tank's corner booth, briefly turning his face into something carved from shadow before the cigarette caught and the darkness settled back. Eli Harper slept in booth 9, curled under a wool blanket someone had pulled from a saddlebag, his head resting on a folded leather jacket that belonged to a man named Griggs, who hadn't spoken a word all night but had taken the jacket off his own back without being asked. The boy's breathing was even. His red fingers had gone pink again. The hospital wristband caught the overhead light every time he shifted. Mason watched the cruisers and felt the question forming in the room behind him. Not spoken, not yet, but alive in the way men shifted their weight and exchanged glances and checked exits. The question every member of the Iron Sentinels was asking without asking. What happens when the sun comes up? They're boxing us in. Skye appeared beside Mason without sound, the way she always did. Former Signals Intelligence, 12 years in. She moved through spaces the way radio waves move through walls, present everywhere, visible nowhere. Her phono was in her hand, screen dimmed. I pulled Roar's badge number from the county website before the signal dropped. Warren Roar, 7 years on the force, no complaints on file. But I ran his name through a public court records search before we lost data, and there are 3 sealed family court cases connected to him. 3. Sealed how? Juvenile matters, which means kids, which means custody disputes or foster placements or protective orders. But sealed means someone with authority decided those records shouldn't be visible. Mason said nothing. He drank cold coffee and stared at the parking lot and let the information settle into the architecture of what he already knew. A deputy who controlled a sick woman. A deputy who tried to cancel an ambulance. A deputy who asked where the boy was before asking how the mother was doing. 3 sealed court cases involving children. The picture forming in Mason's mind was ugly in a way that went beyond bruises. "There's more," Skye said. She kept her voice below the diner's ambient noise, a skill she'd perfected in forward operating bases where the difference between a whispered briefing and a heard one was the difference between an operation and a body bag. When I called County General from Donna's phone, the intake nurse recognized Lena's name immediately, didn't have to look it up. Said, and I quote, "Is Deputy Roar bringing her in again?" Again, Mason. "The hospital knows this woman by name and they associate her with him." Mason's jaw tightened. The coffee cup creaked in his grip. "And when I told the nurse we were the ones bringing her in, civilians, not law enforcement," the line went quiet for about 5 seconds. Then she said, "Make sure you document everything." That's not standard intake language. That's someone who knows something she can't say on a recorded hospital line. "Did you document everything?" "I started the moment we walked into that motel room. Photos on my phone, timestamps. The empty bottles, the discharge papers, the bruising patterns on Lena's arms. I have it." Mason looked at her. Skye's face was controlled, professional, the operational mask she wore when the mission was clear, and the emotions needed to be stored somewhere else until the work was done. But her eyes were different. Behind the discipline, something burned, cold and precise and absolutely furious. "What do you want to do?" she asked. "I want to put Roar through a wall." "And after that?" "I want to find out who's above him." Skye nodded once. "Good, because deputies don't seal court records. Judges do." She walked back to her booth and opened a laptop that ran on battery power and didn't need cell signal to access the files she'd already downloaded. Mason watched her go and felt the old familiar pull, the one that dragged him toward violence the way gravity dragged objects toward the earth. Inevitable. Constant. The only question was how long you could resist before impact. The diner door opened. Cold air rushed in. Every head turned. Tank stepped through, snow on his shoulders, phone in his hand, and an expression on his face that Mason had seen exactly twice before in 20 years of riding together. Once in a VA hospital, when a doctor told Tank his best friend's legs were gone, and once in a courthouse when a judge awarded Tank's ex-wife full custody of a daughter he'd never see grow up. The expression said, "This is worse than we thought." "Hospital called back on Donna's line," Tank said. He crossed to Mason without looking at anyone else. His voice was low, meant only for one pair of ears. Lena's in the ICU, pneumonia, severe, but that's not the problem. The problem is the hospital's CPS liaison flagged Eli as an unsupervised minor the moment Lena's admission hit the system. County protocol says a social worker has to assess the child's placement within 6 hours of a parental hospitalization. And the only county social worker on call tonight is a woman named Fran Geller. I asked the nurse about her. The nurse got real quiet and said, Ms. Geller works closely with Deputy Rohr on placement cases. Mason closed his eyes. The pattern tightened like a noose. So Rohr's got a social worker in his pocket, Mason said. That's how it reads. The nurse said, and she was careful about it, Mason, picking every word like she was walking through a minefield. She said that in the last 2 years, 4 children from families in Rohr's patrol area have been placed in foster care through emergency removals signed off by Geller. 4 kids. All from mothers with substance issues or chronic illness. All placements handled fast, quiet, and through the same foster network. What foster network? She wouldn't say. Said she'd already told me more than she should. Mason opened his eyes. The cruisers outside hadn't moved. The snow hadn't stopped. And the 6-year-old sleeping in booth 9 had just become the next entry in a pattern that no one in this county had been willing to name. Wake him up, a voice said from behind them. Mason turned. Decker, the prospect, stood near the counter with his arms crossed and his young face hard with the particular righteousness of a 23-year-old who hadn't yet learned that the world punished good intentions more reliably than bad ones. Kid needs to be awake, needs to eat more, needs to be ready to move if those cruisers decide to come in here. Nobody's waking that boy up, Mason said. Mason, I'm just saying, I heard what you said. Sit down. Decker didn't sit. He looked around the diner and found the eyes he was looking for. Other young patches, other prospects, men whose blood ran hotter than their judgment ran deep. Mason watched the micro-alliances form in real time, glances exchanged, jaws set. The particular energy of men who wanted action and were being denied it. We've got 77 men, Decker said. 3 cop cars. That's math even I can do. It's not math, it's a trap. Mason's voice dropped to the register that every member of the Iron Sentinels knew meant the conversation was over. Rohr wants us to move on those cruisers. He wants the footage. He wants the mugshots. He wants 77 bikers on the evening news so that when he files the emergency removal order for Eli, the story isn't corrupt Deputy steals child. The story is heroic deputy rescues child from outlaw motorcycle gang. You want to hand him that? Decker's jaw worked. His eyes dropped. He sat. But the energy in the room didn't sit with him. It pulsed in the silence between men. The restless, dangerous frequency of a brotherhood that had been trained to respond to threats with force and was now being asked to respond with patience. Mason felt it pressing against the walls, pressing against him. Tank leaned close. He's not wrong about the math. He's wrong about everything else. How long can we hold this room, Mason? These boys didn't ride into a snowstorm to sit in a diner and watch cop cars through the window. They came because you called a memorial run, and now they're looking at a kid in a blanket and a president who's stalling. How long before someone does something stupid? Long enough. Long enough for what? Mason didn't answer because he didn't have one. The truth was a brick wall he could see coming but couldn't steer around. He had no jurisdiction, no legal standing, no custody claim, no evidence that would hold up in a hearing that hadn't happened yet. He had photographs on Sky's phone and the word of a nurse who'd spoken off the record and the terrified whisper of a woman being loaded into an ambulance. He had guilt. And guilt, in Mason's experience, was the worst possible fuel for good decisions. The diner phone rang. Donna answered it. Her face changed. The color drained from it the way color drains from a sunset when clouds move in. She held the receiver toward Mason without speaking. He took it. Vale. Mr. Vale, this is Fran Geller, Braxton County Department of Social Services. The voice was professional, rehearsed, delivered with the mechanical warmth of a script read. So many times it had lost all connection to actual human concern. I'm calling regarding the minor child Eli Harper. I understand the child is currently at Russline Diner on Route 19. Is that correct? It is. I'll be arriving within the hour to conduct an emergency welfare assessment. Under state code, the child cannot remain in the custody of unrelated adults without a formal placement authorization. I'll need to take temporary custody of Eli pending his mother's medical status. It's midnight in a blizzard. Child safety doesn't observe weather delays, Mr. Vale. And where exactly would you be taking him? A pause. The kind of pause that happens when a question lands somewhere it wasn't expected. That would be determined by the assessment. Would Deputy Rohr be involved in that determination? A longer pause. Mason could hear the recalculation happening on the other end of the line, the gears of a scripted conversation grinding against an obstacle they hadn't been designed to handle. Deputy Rohr is the responding officer for this area. His input would be part of the standard process. His input. Mason looked across the diner at the sleeping boy. Ms. Geller, I want to be very clear about something. There is a child in this building who walked a mile through a blizzard because his mother was too sick to wake up. That mother is now in the ICU at County General with bruises on her arms that she didn't put there. The responding officer you just mentioned tried to cancel the ambulance that saved her life. So when you say his input would be part of the standard process, I want you to understand what I'm hearing. Silence on the line. I'll be there within the hour, Geller said, and hung up. Mason held the dead receiver for a moment before setting it down. Donna watched him from behind the counter with an expression that mixed fear and something else. A recognition, maybe. The look of a woman who'd lived in a small town long enough to know its secrets and had been waiting, without knowing it, for someone to say them out loud. You just poked a hornet's nest, she said quietly. Wasn't the first one today. Rohr's connected, Mr. County Prosecutor, Sheriff Braddock. Half the foster families in the district get placement fees that run through his office. You don't know what you're stepping into. Tell me. Donna looked at the sleeping boy, looked at the bikers, looked at her own hands, cracked and weathered from decades of pouring coffee for people who never tipped enough. 3 years ago, she said, keeping her voice barely above a whisper, a woman named Sarah Whitfield came in here with her 2 boys. Twins. 4 years old. She was trying to get to her sister's place in Morgantown. Rohr pulled her over that same afternoon. DUI, he said, though Sarah Whitfield hadn't touched a drink in her life. 2 weeks later, those twins were in foster care. 1 month after that, Sarah lost parental rights. I never saw those boys again. She paused, wiped the counter with a rag that was already clean. Sarah came back once, sat right where that boy's sitting, told me Rohr had fabricated the entire case, told me the social worker, Geller, had signed off on the removal without ever visiting the home, told me the foster family that got her kids was connected to a man named Harlan Voss, who runs a network of group homes across 3 counties. What happened to Sarah? Overdose. 8 months later. Found her in her car outside the Sunrise Motel. The sentence dropped into the space between them like a stone into deep water. Mason felt it ripple outward through everything he thought he understood about this town. Room 12? He asked. Donna's eyes answered before her mouth did. Mason turned away from the counter. The diner felt different now. Not smaller. Heavier. As if the building itself was absorbing the weight of what had been happening inside this county while everyone looked the other way. He found Tank and Sky at the corner booth. He sat. He told them. Every word. Geller's call. Donna's story. Sarah Whitfield and her twins. Harlan Voss and his foster network. The pattern that connected Rohr to disappearing children and dead mothers, and a system that manufactured emergencies to feed a pipeline no one had bothered to investigate. Tank's face didn't change. It rarely did. But his hands, massive, scarred, capable of bending steel, went flat on the table and pressed down until his knuckles whitened. How many? Tank said. Don't know. At least 4 that the nurse mentioned, maybe more. Sky had her laptop open. Her fingers moved across the keyboard with the focused speed of someone pulling threads that were starting to connect. Harlan Voss. I have a hit. He owns a company called Summit Ridge Youth Services, registered in Charleston. 3 residential care facilities in Braxton, Nicholas, and Webster counties. State-licensed foster network. Annual revenue. She trailed off. Her fingers stopped. Mason. State records show Summit Ridge received $2.3 million in foster care placement fees last fiscal year, from a 3-county operation with a total capacity of 42 beds. That's a lot of money for 42 kids. That's a lot of money for anyone. And the licensing inspections, the last 3 were all signed off by the same state reviewer, who also happens to sit on the board of a nonprofit that Voss founded. Tank leaned back. The booth creaked. So Rohr finds the kids. Geller rubber stamps the removals. Voss collects the state checks. And anyone who pushes back ends up dead or destroyed. That's the shape of it, Mason said. And we're sitting in the middle of it with the next kid on their list. Yeah. The 3 of them sat in the silence that follows when the scope of something terrible becomes clear and the options narrow to 2, walk away or walk in deeper. Mason had spent his entire adult life choosing the second option in combat, in bar fights, in club politics. But this was different. This wasn't about him. This was about a boy sleeping in a booth who didn't have the luxury of choosing anything. There's something else, Mason said. He'd been holding it, carrying it since the ambulance pulled away from the Sunrise Motel. Lena grabbed my hand before they took her. She said, "Don't let Rohr take him. He'll disappear him." Disappear. That was the word she used. Sky's typing stopped. Tank's jaw tightened until the muscles in his neck stood out like cables. "She knows," Sky said. "She knows exactly what he's doing. She's been inside it. That's why he's kept her medicated and isolated. Not to control her, but to keep her quiet. She's a witness." "And now she's in a hospital where he has access," Mason said. "And the social worker is an hour away from walking through that door to take her son." The clock above the diner counter read 12:34 a.m., 40 minutes, maybe less. Decker appeared at the booth's edge. Behind him, 6 other young patches stood in a loose cluster. Not threatening, not yet, but organized in a way that carried its own message. Men forming a faction, men looking for a direction their president hadn't provided. "We heard," Decker said. "The walls in this place are thin." "Then you know the situation." "I know a social worker's coming to take that kid. I know 3 cop cars are outside. And I know you're sitting in a booth having a meeting." Tank started to rise. Mason put a hand on his arm. "Say what you came to say, Decker." The prospect's eyes were steady, angry, but steady. "Some of us rode with Caleb. Not many. He was before my time. But Griggs did, and Boone, and Harker. They told me about him. Good man, quiet. The kind of brother who'd pull a double shift to cover your ride home. And now his kid is sleeping 20 feet away from us while someone plans to come through that door and steal him." Decker paused. His voice dropped. "We didn't ride 500 miles in a blizzard to watch that happen." Mason looked at the young man and saw something he recognized. The same fire he'd carried at 23, before the war burned it down to embers, before grief and failure taught him that fire without direction just consumed the person carrying it. "Nobody's watching anything happen," Mason said. "But we're not going to war with a county sheriff's department in a diner parking lot. Not tonight." "Then when?" "When the ground is right." "The ground is a 6-year-old in a booth, Mason. How much more right does it need to be?" The room had gone quiet. Every biker in the diner was listening. Mason could feel the weight of it. 77 men's attention pressing against him like a physical force, demanding an answer he wasn't ready to give because giving it meant committing to something that would change everything. He looked at Eli. Still asleep, still breathing, still wrapped in a dead biker's borrowed jacket. He looked at the clock. 12:41 a.m. He looked at the 3 cruisers outside, patient as predators. "Sky," Mason said, "how long to compile everything you have into something a judge would look at? 2 hours? Maybe 3, if I can get cell signal to access state court databases." "Tank, who do we know in the state police?" Tank's eyes narrowed. "You want to go over the county?" "I want to go around it." "Sergeant named Colvin. Ran into him at a veterans thing 2 years back. State Criminal Investigation Division. Hard case, but straight. I've got his personal number somewhere." "Find it." Mason stood. The booth released him with a creak of vinyl. He looked at Decker, then passed him at the cluster of young patches waiting for something to believe in. "Here's what happens," Mason said, and his voice carried to every corner of the room. "Nobody touches those cruisers. Nobody walks into that parking lot. Nobody gives Rohr or anyone else a reason to call this anything other than what it is: citizens sheltering a child during a medical emergency. When the social worker arrives, we cooperate. We're polite. We document every word she says and every form she fills out. And while that's happening, Sky builds a case file and Tank gets the state police on the phone." "And if she tries to take the boy?" Decker asked. Mason looked at him. She won't. How do you know? Because I'm going to be standing between her and that booth, and I'm going to ask her questions she can't answer without incriminating every person she works with. She walks in here expecting a room full of criminals she can steamroll. She's going to find 77 witnesses instead. Decker held Mason's gaze for a long moment. Then he nodded. Once. Turned to the young patches behind him. You heard him. They dispersed. The energy in the room shifted. Still charged, still dangerous, but pointed now. Directed. The difference between a live wire sparking on wet ground and a live wire connected to a circuit. Mason walked to booth 9. He crouched beside Eli. The boy was deep in sleep, his small chest rising and falling beneath the blanket, his fingers still curled loosely around something invisible, the ghost of $1.37, maybe. The habit of holding on to whatever you had because everything else had been taken. Mason didn't touch him, didn't wake him. Just crouched there in the yellow diner light and listened to the boy breathe and thought about Caleb Harper dying in a hospital bed 6 years ago, with a promise in his ears that turned out to be a lie. Not anymore. He stood, turned back to the room, and through the frosted front window, headlights appeared on Route 19, not cruisers this time, but a dark sedan moving slowly through the snow with government plates and a county seal on the door. Fran Geller was early. Behind the sedan, a fourth cruiser fell into formation, and behind that, pulling out from a side road Mason hadn't noticed, a black SUV with tinted windows and no plates at all rolled to a stop beneath the dead streetlight at the edge of the lot. The engine idled, the headlights went dark, and nobody got out. The sedan's door opened at 12:58 a.m. Fran Geller stepped out into the snow wearing a county-issued parka over a pantsuit that looked like it had been put on in a hurry. Collar crooked, one button misaligned, the rushed assembly of a woman who'd been called out of bed for something she'd done enough times to have a routine for. She was mid-50s, thin in the way people get thin when stress eats more calories than food provides, and she carried a leather portfolio under one arm, like a weapon she'd learned to wield better than most men wielded fists. She didn't look at the cruisers, didn't look at the black SUV, walked straight to the diner door, as if the only thing that existed in the universe was the task in front of her. Mason watched her cross the lot through the frosted glass. Behind him, the diner had rearranged itself without instruction. Bikers who'd been scattered across booths and counter stools had quietly consolidated, creating a corridor of occupied seats that led from the front door directly to booth 9 where Eli slept. Not a blockade, not a threat. A geometry of witnesses. 77 men positioned so that every angle of the room was observed, every word spoken would be heard, and every action taken would be remembered by more people than any courtroom could dismiss. Skye sat at the counter with her laptop open, recording software active, a legal pad beside her with notes in handwriting so precise it looked printed. Tank stood by the kitchen door with his arms crossed and his phone in his breast pocket, the camera lens facing outward. Even Donna had positioned herself behind the register with a clear sight line to the door, her weathered hand steady on the counter. The bell rang. Cold air. Snow. Fran Geller. She stopped 2 steps inside and scanned the room. The way a person scans a room when they expected resistance, but not this much of it. Her eyes moved across the leather cuts and the tattoos and the faces that watched her with the patient, unblinking attention of men who had decided that looking away was no longer an option. I'm looking for the minor child, Eli Harper, she said. Professional, practiced, a sentence she'd delivered before. I'm Fran Geller, Braxton County Department of Social Services. I have authority under state code to conduct an emergency welfare assessment. Mason stepped forward. I'm Mason Vale. We spoke on the phone. We did. Where's the child? Sleeping, Bean. I'll need to see him. You will, after you answer some questions. Geller's mouth tightened. The portfolio shifted under her arm. Mr. Vale, I'm not here to be questioned. I'm here to ensure the safety of a child whose mother is currently hospitalized and who has no authorized guardian present. I understand, and I'm here to ensure the safety of that same child, which is why I'd like to know a few things before you walk any further into this room. Mason kept his voice level, conversational. The tone of a man asking reasonable questions in an unreasonable situation. First, who requested this assessment? It's automatic. Hospital admission triggers. Who called you, Ms. Geller? Tonight. Specifically, who picked up a phone and told you to drive through a blizzard at midnight? The pause was small, but it was there, a half-second recalculation. Deputy Rohr contacted my office as a courtesy notification. Before or after the hospital admission? I don't see how that's before or after. Geller's eyes hardened. Before. But that's standard coordination between law enforcement and social services when a child welfare concern is identified. So Deputy Rohr identified a child welfare concern before Lena Harper was even admitted to the hospital, before the ambulance arrived, before anyone in the medical system had assessed anything. Silence. That's an interesting timeline, Mason said. Mr. Vale, I'm not going to stand in a doorway and be interrogated by a civilian. I have legal authority. You have authority to assess, so assess. Mason stepped aside and gestured toward the room. Eli's in booth 9. He's warm, fed, sleeping safely. We called the ambulance for his mother. We brought him here out of the cold. 77 adults are present. The child has not been harmed, neglected, or endangered by anyone in this building. He paused. Can you say the same about everyone outside it? Geller stared at him. Something moved behind her expression. Not guilt, not fear, but the particular discomfort of someone whose rehearsed script had been interrupted by a scene partner who wasn't following the stage directions. She walked past Mason without responding and moved through the corridor of occupied booths toward Eli. The bikers watched her pass. Nobody spoke. Nobody moved. The only sounds were her heels on linoleum, the wind against the windows, and the low electric hum of the refrigerated pie case near the register. She reached booth 9, looked down at the sleeping boy, opened her portfolio and began filling out a form. Checkbox, checkbox, notes in the margin, the bureaucratic choreography of a system processing a child. He appears well-nourished and stable, she said, almost to herself. No visible injuries. No, Mason said from behind her. Those are on his mother. Geller's pen stopped. Bruises on both arms, patterns consistent with being grabbed repeatedly, empty prescription bottles by the bed. A discharge from County General 6 days ago with no follow-up care arranged. A motel room that's been used to isolate her from every support system she might have. Mason's voice stayed level, but the temperature in it dropped with every sentence. You're the county social worker, Ms. Geller. You've been the county social worker for how long? 11 years. In 11 years, how many times has Lena Harper appeared in your system? Nothing. How many times has Deputy Rohr referred a case to your office? Nothing. How many children have you placed through Summit Ridge Youth Services? Geller's pen hit the floor. She bent to pick it up, and the motion was too fast, too sharp. The reflex of someone who'd been struck rather than someone who'd dropped a pen. When she straightened, her face was different. The professional mask had cracked along fault lines that had been there all along, and what leaked through wasn't authority. It was fear. She knew that name, and she hadn't expected to hear it in a diner in Black Creek at 1 a.m. from a man in a leather cut. I don't know what you're talking about, she said. Summit Ridge Youth Services, owned by Harlan Voss. 3 residential facilities, $2.3 million in annual placement fees. You've never heard of it? This assessment is about the child, not about, it's about all the children, Ms. Geller. That's the part you keep trying to make smaller. Geller closed her portfolio. Her hands were shaking. Not a lot. A tremor at the fingertips, the kind most people wouldn't notice. But Mason noticed because he'd spent 2 decades reading the body language of people who were deciding whether to fight or run. I'm going to recommend temporary placement, she said. Her voice had lost its rehearsed quality. It sounded thinner now, smaller. The child cannot remain with unrelated adults. That's not a judgment. It's protocol. Placement where? An approved foster home. Which one? That would be determined by Summit Ridge? The tremor spread from her fingers to her jaw. She clenched it shut. You walk out of here with that recommendation, Mason said, stepping close enough that only she could hear him. And tomorrow morning, Eli Harper enters the same system that swallowed Sarah Whitfield's twins. And you'll sign the form that makes it happen, just like you signed the others. Geller's eyes went wet. Not with sadness. With the particular moisture that comes when terror and shame collide inside a person who has spent years building walls between themselves and the consequences of their compliance. You don't understand, she whispered. Then help me understand. You can't fight this. Not from inside a diner. Not with motorcycles and attitude. You don't know who these people are. Tell me. I can't. You can. You just haven't decided to yet. Geller looked at the sleeping boy. She looked at the bikers surrounding her in their silent, measured witness. She looked at the frosted window where cruiser lights pulsed in the dark, and Mason watched the war inside her. Duty against survival, conscience against fear, the accumulated weight of 11 years of knowing against 11 years of silence. She opened her mouth. The diner phone rang. Donna answered, listened. Her face went white. She held the receiver toward Mason with a hand that trembled in a way her hands had never trembled before. Hospital, she said. Mason took the phone. Vale. Mr. Vale, this is Nurse Carver from County General ICU. The voice was professional but strained, the forced composure of someone delivering information they wish they didn't have. I'm calling regarding Lena Harper. Her condition has been stabilized, but there's been an incident. Deputy Rohr arrived at the hospital 20 minutes ago with a court order granting him emergency temporary guardianship of the minor child, Eli Harper. Mason's blood went cold. Actually cold. A physical sensation, as if someone had replaced the fluid in his veins with ice water. A court order, he said, signed by Judge Marcus Cole. Braxton County Family Court. It authorizes Deputy Rohr to take immediate physical custody of the child and prohibits any interference by unrelated parties. At 1 a.m, in a blizzard, a judge signed an emergency custody order. I'm only relaying what was presented, Mr. Vale. The order looks legitimate. Hospital administration has accepted it pending verification. Is Rohr with Lena now? Silence. Is he with her? He attempted to access her room. ICU protocol requires medical staff authorization for law enforcement visits. He's currently in the waiting area. Don't let him near her, do you hear me? Whatever that order says, it covers the child, not the mother. You have no legal obligation to let him into her room. Mr. Vale, Nurse Carver. She told me he would try to make her son disappear. Those were her words. Whatever is happening in your hospital right now is part of that. Don't let him near her. The line hummed. Mason could hear the ICU's ambient machinery, monitors beeping, ventilators cycling, the sterile soundtrack of lives being maintained by systems while people failed them. I'll do what I can, Nurse Carver said, and hung up. Mason set the phone down. The diner was silent. Every man in the room had read his face the way combat veterans read a squad leader's face when the briefing goes wrong, not listening for words, listening for the frequency of disaster. He's got a court order, Mason said. Judge named Cole. Emergency custody. Signed tonight. Tank's expression didn't change. His fists did. They closed slowly, deliberately, the way a machine closes. Mechanical, inevitable, designed for one purpose. Skye stood from the counter. Judge Marcus Cole. I've seen that name. She scrolled through her laptop with focused speed. Cole? Cole. Here. He's the family court judge who presided over the sealed cases connected to RO. All three of them. Same judge. Every time. So the judge is in on it, Tank said. The judge, the social worker, the deputy, and the foster network operator, Skye said. This isn't corruption. This is infrastructure. The word landed in the room and stayed there. Infrastructure. Not a single dirty cop or a compromised bureaucrat. A system. Designed, maintained, and operated by people who had divided the work of destroying families into neat institutional functions so that no single participant had to see the full picture of what they were building, except they all did. Every one of them. They just called it protocol. Geller was still standing beside booth 9. She hadn't moved during the phone call. Her portfolio hung at her side, forgotten. Her face had the blank, hollowed expression of someone watching a building collapse that she helped construct. Mason turned to her. Did you know about Cole? She didn't answer. Did you know the judge was signing emergency orders for Rohr in the middle of the night? I knew. Her voice was barely audible. I knew about Cole. I knew about Voss. I knew about the placements. I knew about all of it. The room absorbed this. I didn't start it, she continued, and now the words came faster, loosened by something that was either confession or panic. When I took this job 11 years ago, the system was already in place. Rohr approached me in my second year, said the county needed flexibility in placement cases. Said sometimes the formal process was too slow to protect kids in danger. It sounded reasonable. It sounded like he was trying to help. When did it stop sounding that way? Her eyes found the floor. When the first mother died. Mason felt the room tighten around him. 77 men inhaling at once. Sarah Whitfield, Geller said. She was supposed to be a standard case. Mother with a history of instability, twins at risk, emergency removal for their protection. That's what Rohr told me. That's what the paperwork said. But Sarah wasn't unstable. She was clean, employed, trying to get to her sister's house. Fabricated the DUI. I signed the removal papers. And 6 months later, she was dead in a car outside the Sunrise Motel, and her children were inside Summit Ridge, and I was standing in my kitchen at 3 a.m., staring at my hands and wondering what I'd become. But you kept signing. It wasn't a question. It wasn't an accusation. It was a statement of fact delivered in the flat, exhausted tone of a man who understood complicity because he'd practiced his own version of it for 6 years. Geller looked at him. Do you know what happens to people who stop cooperating with Warren Rohr? Tell me. There was a caseworker before me, Nancy Phelps. She started asking questions about the placement numbers. 2 weeks later, she was arrested for embezzlement. Charges that appeared out of nowhere, supported by financial records she'd never seen. She lost her license, her house, her family. Last I heard, she was living in a shelter in Clarksburg. Geller's voice cracked. And she got off easy. There was a teacher at the elementary school, a man named Garza, who reported concerns about one of the Summit Ridge homes. Suspected abuse. He filed with the state. 3 days later, someone put photographs on his computer that shouldn't have been there. He's in a federal prison now. The diner was so quiet, Mason could hear the snow hitting the windows. So yes, Geller said, I kept signing, because the alternative was becoming the next Nancy Phelps, or the next Garza, or the next Sarah Whitfield. She looked at Eli. The sleeping boy hadn't moved. His breathing was deep and even, the unconscious trust of a child who didn't know that the adults around him were negotiating his future in whispers. That boy is next on the list, Geller said. Rohr has been watching that family since Caleb died. He waited. He's patient. He waits until the mother is broken enough that the paperwork looks clean. Lena held on longer than most. She fought. She moved. She tried to stay invisible. But the pneumonia gave him his window. By tomorrow morning, he'll have Eli in a Summit Ridge facility, and Lena will sign whatever he puts in front of her because she'll be delirious and medicated and terrified, and that will be the end of it. Unless, Mason said. Unless what? You have 77 bikers and 3 cups of coffee. He has a judge, a sheriff, a foster network, and a court order. This isn't a fight you can win by standing in a doorway. Mason looked at Sky. How solid is what you've got? Court records linking Cole to all 3 sealed cases. State licensing data on Summit Ridge showing financial anomalies. Photographs of Lena's injuries with timestamps. The hospital intake nurse's statements. And now a first-hand witness. She looked at Geller. If she's willing to go on record. Geller went still. The fear came back, physical, visible, a contraction in her shoulders and a tightening around her eyes that made her look like someone bracing for impact. On record means dead, she said. On record means those kids have a chance, Sky replied. You don't live here. You don't know what he... I know exactly what men like him do. I spent 12 years in places where men like him run entire provinces. The playbook doesn't change. Control the institutions, isolate the witnesses, manufacture consequences for anyone who talks. But it only works as long as no one talks. The moment one person breaks, the whole structure fractures. You know that. You've known it for years. Geller was shaking, not just her hands, her entire body. A whole system tremor that came from somewhere deeper than muscle. Somewhere in the place where a person stores the accumulated weight of every choice they wish they hadn't made. The front door opened. Cold air. Snow. And Deputy Warren Rohr walked in. He was alone, no backup, no weapon drawn. Just a man in a clean uniform stepping across the threshold of a diner full of outlaw bikers as if he owned the room. Because in his mind, in this county, in the architecture of control he'd spent years constructing, he did. He carried a manila folder. Ms. Geller, he said, not looking at Mason. Are we ready? Geller's trembling stopped. Not because the fear was gone, but because it had reached a depth where the body simply couldn't express it anymore. She stood motionless beside the sleeping boy. The court order's been delivered to County General, Rohr continued. His voice was calm, pleasant, the tone of a man discussing paperwork over lunch. Judge Cole signed it at 12:15. I have copies here for your file. He held out the manila folder. All we need is your assessment signature, and we can transport the child to emergency placement. At 1 in the morning, Mason said. Rohr looked at him now. The dead calm eyes. The empty smile. Child safety doesn't observe business hours, Mr. Vale. I believe Ms. Geller told you that. Mason felt the room behind him. Not as sound, but as pressure. 77 men holding their positions, holding their discipline, holding the line between witness and violence, while a man in a badge tried to steal a child in front of them. The child is safe here, Mason said. The child is in the custody of unrelated adults in a public restaurant. That's not safe. That's a liability. Rohr extended the folder toward Geller again. Fran, the form. Geller looked at the folder, looked at Rohr, looked at Mason. The moment stretched. The clock ticked. Snow hit glass. Geller started. Fran. Rohr's voice dropped half a register. Not angry, controlled. The particular frequency a man uses when he wants a woman to remember what obedience costs and what disobedience costs more. The form. Geller reached for the folder. Ms. Geller. Sky's voice cut across the room from the counter, clear and precise. Before you sign anything, you should know that I've compiled a case file documenting Deputy Rohr's involvement in at least 4 emergency child removals, all processed through Judge Cole's court, all placed through Summit Ridge Youth Services. The file includes financial records, hospital statements, and time-stamped photographic evidence of physical abuse on Lena Harper's body. It's saved in 3 locations and scheduled to upload to a state police secure server the moment I regain cell signal. The diner went absolutely still. Rohr's smile didn't change, but something behind it did, a tectonic shift in the geology of his composure, invisible on the surface but catastrophic underneath. He turned slowly to look at Sky, and for the first time all night, his eyes showed something other than control. They showed calculation, the rapid, desperate math of a man who has just discovered that the walls he built have a crack in them and is trying to figure out how much water is coming through before the flood becomes unsurvivable. That's a very serious accusation, he said. It's not an accusation, it's a file. Accusations come later. Rohr looked at Mason, looked at Tank, looked at the 77 faces watching him from every booth and stool and shadow in the room, and Mason saw the moment the deputy realized that the room he'd walked into was not the room he expected, that these weren't criminals he could outmaneuver with paperwork, but witnesses he couldn't silence with fear. I'd like to speak with Ms. Geller privately, Rohr said. No, Mason said. This is a county matter between county employees. Ms. Geller isn't going anywhere with you. Not tonight, not privately. Rohr's jaw flexed. The smile was gone now. What replaced it was the raw face beneath, angular, predatory, stripped of every performance he'd been running since he walked through the door. You're obstructing a lawful custody transfer, Mr. Vale. I'm protecting a child, Deputy Rohr. The difference is in the file. Rohr looked at Geller one more time. The look carried weight, threat, history, the accumulated leverage of years of shared complicity. It was the look of a man reminding a woman what she stood to lose. Geller held the folder in both hands. Her knuckles were white. Her breath came in shallow bursts. She opened the folder, looked at the form inside. A single page. A signature line. The bureaucratic instrument that would transfer Eli Harper from this room to a system designed to consume him. She picked up her pen. And then she put the folder on the table, unsigned, and stepped away from booth 9. I'm not signing, she said. Rohr stared at her. Not tonight. Not for this child. Not anymore. Fran, think about what you're... I've been thinking about it for 9 years. I'm done thinking. Something flashed across Rohr's face. Not anger, not surprise, but the particular fury of a man watching a machine he built refuse to function. He straightened his shoulders. He picked up the unsigned folder. He looked at Mason with eyes that promised violence in a language that didn't require words. This isn't over, he said. I know, Mason said. Rohr turned and walked to the door. He opened it, paused, looked back at the room, at the bikers, the boy, the social worker who had just broken rank for the first time in a decade. The court order stands, he said. You can delay, but you can't stop it. By morning, I'll have a state marshal and a sheriff's unit at this door. 77 bikers won't stop what's coming. You've just made it worse for everyone, especially the boy." He walked out. The door closed. Cold air settled. Silence. Then Tank spoke. "He's right about the marshal." Mason knew. A signed court order from a sitting judge wasn't a bluff. It was legal machinery, and no amount of witness documentation would stop it from grinding forward in the next few hours. Sky's file was a weapon, but it was a long-range weapon. It needed the state police. It needed a different judge. It needed time that they were running out of like water through cracked hands. "How long until sunrise?" Mason asked. 5, maybe 6 hours? And the storm? Weakening. Roads might be passable by dawn. Mason looked at the room, at the bikers who had followed him through a blizzard and were now sitting inside a trap that was closing by the hour. At Geller, who had just burned every bridge she had and was standing near the counter with the numb, glazed expression of someone who jumped from a building and was still falling. At Eli, who hadn't woken through any of it. The deepest sleep of exhaustion and trust. The sleep of a child who believed, for the first time in his short life, that the adults around him might actually stay. "We can't keep him here," Sky said quietly, appearing at Mason's side. "Roar's right about the legal machinery. A court order is a court order. If a marshal shows up with paper and badges, we either hand the child over or we become kidnappers. There's no middle ground." "Then we change the paper." "What?" "We need a different judge. Someone outside Cole's orbit. Someone with jurisdiction to override an emergency custody order and issue a temporary restraining order against Roar's access to the child." "Mason, it's 1 in the morning in rural West Virginia in a snowstorm. Where exactly do you plan to find a judge?" Tank stepped forward. His massive frame blocked the overhead light and threw a shadow across the booth where Eli slept. "Colvin," he said, "the state police sergeant. If I can reach him, he can reach a state-level family court judge. Different jurisdiction, different system entirely. Cole's order came from county court. A state judge can supersede it. Can you reach him?" "Phone's dead. Storm killed everything between here and the interstate." Tank paused, looked at the window, at the snow that had been falling for hours but was, maybe, possibly, beginning to thin. "But the state police barracks in Elkins is 47 miles northeast. If the roads are opening up, you want to ride 47 miles through a blizzard." "I've ridden through worse for less." Mason looked at him. 20 years of brotherhood compressed into a single glance. They'd served together, bled together, buried friends together, and sat in hospital waiting rooms together, wondering which one of them would outlive the other. Tank had never asked for permission. I was asking now because this wasn't about them. It was about a 6-year-old boy who had no voice in the decision that would determine the rest of his life. "Take Griggs and Boone," Mason said. 3 bikes. If one goes down, the others get through." Tank nodded. He didn't waste time on goodbyes. He crossed the diner, spoke 2 words to Griggs and Boone, and all 3 men stood and pulled on their gloves and their helmets and walked out into the dark without looking back. 30 seconds later, 3 Harleys fired to life in the parking lot. The sound was enormous in the frozen silence, thunder and defiance, and the stubborn roar of men who treated weather the way they treated every other thing that tried to stop them. The engines faded into the storm. Mason stood alone in the quiet they left behind. Outside, the cruisers hadn't moved. The black SUV hadn't moved. And somewhere inside that SUV, or inside a warm office, or inside a house that county money had paid for, Harlan Voss was awake and making phone calls. Mason looked at the clock. 1:47 a.m. He looked at Eli, and he understood, with the clarity that only comes when every option has been exhausted and every exit has been blocked, that the man he'd been for the last 6 years was not the man who would get this boy through the night. The rider, the drinker, the president who led from the front and grieved from a distance. That man had failed Caleb Harper's family once already. That man had driven away from a promise because keeping it required something he didn't have. Not courage. Mason had never lacked courage, patience, sacrifice, the willingness to stand still in a burning room because someone smaller than you couldn't run. He pulled a chair from an empty table and set it beside booth 9. He sat down. He crossed his arms. And he watched the door. 5 hours until sunrise. 47 miles of frozen highway between Tank and the only judge who could stop what was coming. And a black SUV idling in the dark with an engine that hadn't shut off once since it arrived. Waiting, like everything else in Braxton County, for the machine to finish what it started. Mason didn't sleep. He sat in that wooden chair beside Booth 9 for 3 hours and 11 minutes, while the diner settled into the uneasy quiet of men waiting for something they couldn't name. Some bikers dozed in their booths with their arms crossed and their chins on their chests, sleeping the way soldiers sleep, light, fractured, one ear always tuned to the frequency of incoming threat. Others sat awake with cold coffee and cigarettes, and the particular silence of men whose minds were louder than anything their mouths could produce. Skye worked her laptop in a cone of blue-white light, building the case file one document at a time, cross-referencing court records with state licensing databases she'd cached before the signal died. Fran Geller sat alone in the booth farthest from the door, with her hands wrapped around a mug she hadn't drunk from, staring at the table with the vacant focus of a woman replaying 9 years of her life and finding nothing in any of it worth keeping. Eli slept through all of it. At 4:12 a.m., the boy shifted in his sleep, and his hand reached out and found Mason's arm on the chair rest and held on. Small fingers on leather. The unconscious grip of a child reaching for something solid in the dark. Mason didn't move, didn't pull away, just sat there with a 6-year-old's hand on his sleeve and the weight of a dead man's promise pressing against his chest like a second heartbeat. At 4:38 a.m., Donna refilled his coffee without being asked. She set the cup down and looked at Eli's hand on Mason's arm and looked at Mason's face and said nothing, because some things didn't need language. She walked back to the counter and started a fresh pot for what would be the 7th time that night. At 5:01 a.m., a phone rang. Not the diner's landline, Skye's satellite phone. A military-grade device she kept in her saddlebag for situations exactly like this one. A relic from a career spent in places where cellular infrastructure was a luxury and communication was survival. Every awake biker turned toward the sound. Skye answered, listened. Her face didn't change, it never did during operational communication, but her hand moved to her legal pad and began writing with the rapid precision of someone transcribing intelligence in real time. She spoke 3 words in 2 minutes. Understood. Confirmed. Standing by. She hung up, looked at Mason. Tank made it. The room exhaled. He reached the state police barracks in Elkins at 3:47 a.m. Sergeant Colvin was off duty, but Tank called his personal line. Colvin's been aware of irregularities in Braxton County's foster placement numbers for over a year. His division flagged the financial data but couldn't get a warrant because the complaints were coming from inside the system and getting buried before they reached state level. He has a warrant now? He has something better. He woke up Judge Evelyn Hart, State Family Court, 15th Judicial Circuit. She's been on the bench for 22 years and she has a reputation for exactly one thing. What's that? She doesn't lose cases she takes, and she doesn't take cases that don't make her angry. Skye paused. Tank says Colvin described her as the kind of woman who makes prosecutors check their paperwork twice and judges in other districts avoid eye contact. She reviewed a summary of our evidence over the phone. She's issuing an emergency temporary restraining order against Deputy Rohr's custody claim and a superseding hold on all Braxton County family court orders pending state-level review. Mason leaned forward. When? She's driving to the barracks now to sign it in person. Colvin's dispatching a state police unit to serve the order here and at County General simultaneously. ETA is, Skye checked her notes, 90 minutes, maybe 2 hours depending on roads. 2 hours. Mason looked at the cruisers outside. Still there. Still waiting. The black SUV hadn't moved either. A patient, ominous shape at the edge of the lot that hadn't revealed its occupant or its purpose and was more threatening for its silence than any siren could have been. We hold, Mason said. 2 hours. That's all. Mason? Skye's voice dropped. There's a complication. Colvin told Tank that Rohr has a pattern when operations start collapsing. He doesn't retreat. He accelerates. Every time someone's gotten close to exposing the placement network, Rohr has moved to secure the asset, meaning the child, before the legal system can intervene. He'll create a crisis. A medical emergency, a fire alarm, a jurisdictional dispute, anything that gives him physical access to the child in the chaos. He already has a court order, which Judge Hart is about to invalidate. But Rohr doesn't know that yet. All he knows is that his social worker just defected, his paperwork stalled, and 77 witnesses are sitting between him and the boy. He's running out of institutional tools, which means he's about to switch to operational ones. Mason understood. The vocabulary was military, but the logic was universal. A man who controlled systems used systems. A man who lost control of systems used force. And force, applied to a diner full of bikers at 5 in the morning, meant something was about to happen that couldn't be undone by paperwork. "Wake everyone up," Mason said. The diner came alive in 90 seconds. Bikers rose from booths, shook sleep from their faces, pulled on jackets, checked exits. The energy wasn't panicked. It was organized. The rehearsed alertness of men who'd spent their lives in environments where the difference between ready and not ready was the difference between standing and horizontal. Decker appeared at Mason's side. "What do you need?" "Eyes on every door, windows too. Nobody comes in without being seen first. Nobody goes out alone." "And the kid?" Mason looked at Eli, still asleep, still holding the sleeve of a man he'd met 6 hours ago. "The kid doesn't leave my sight." At 5:19 a.m., the first cruiser moved. It pulled out of the triangle formation across the road and repositioned to the east side of the diner, blocking the side exit. A second cruiser moved to the west side. The third stayed where it was, covering the front door. They were surrounding the building. "That's not standard," Sky said from the window. "That's a perimeter." At 5:23 a.m., the black SUV's headlights came on. The vehicle moved slowly across the lot and parked directly in front of the diner's entrance, 30 feet from the door, engine running. The headlights pointed at the windows like searchlights. Inside the diner, the light threw sharp shadows across booths and tables, and the faces of men who stood in the harsh white glare and watched something begin that they couldn't stop and couldn't look away from. The SUV's driver door opened. A man stepped out. He was tall, taller than Mason, taller than Tank, which was rare. 60 years old, maybe older, but built with the dense, preserved solidity of someone who'd spent their life in physical labor and never stopped. He wore a heavy canvas coat over a flannel shirt, work boots, no hat. His hair was silver white and cropped short. His face was weathered, leather stretched over high cheekbones and deep-set eyes that surveyed the diner's facade with the disinterested assessment of a man looking at property he already owned. He reached into the SUV and pulled out a file folder. Thick. The kind of thickness that comes from years of documentation. He closed the door, crossed the lot. His boots left clean prints in the fresh snow. Measured, unhurried, each step placed with the deliberate calm of someone who had never been in a room he couldn't control. He opened the diner door and walked in. 74 bikers stared at him from every corner. He didn't flinch, didn't slow. Walked to the counter as if the room were empty, set the folder down, and looked at Donna. "Coffee," he said. "Black." Donna's hand trembled as she poured. "You're Harlan Voss," Mason said from beside booth 9. The man picked up his coffee, took a slow sip, and turned to face Mason with the absolute composure of someone who'd been named in dark rooms before and never once been bothered by it. "I am." His voice was deep, calm, rural West Virginia without apology. "And you're Mason Vale, president of the Iron Sentinels, formerly of the United States Army, 2nd Battalion, 75th Ranger Regiment, medically discharged in 2009. 2 arrests, no convictions. Current residence, Allegheny County, Pennsylvania. Credit score 611. Am I missing anything?" The diner went cold. Not from the draft. From the realization that this man had spent the hours since midnight not sleeping, not worrying, but researching, preparing. Assembling information the way a general assembles ordnance before a battle. Not because he was afraid, but because information was how he fought, and he never entered a room without enough of it to win. "You've been busy," Mason said. "I'm always busy, Mr. Vale. Busy is what keeps 42 children fed, housed, and supervised in 3 counties where the state can barely keep the lights on in its own offices." Voss set down his coffee. "I understand there's been some confusion tonight about a child named Eli Harper." "There's no confusion. There's always confusion when outsiders insert themselves into local systems they don't understand. I came here to resolve it, personally, before this situation escalates into something that hurts the boy more than it helps him." "You came here to take him." Voss smiled. It was the most dangerous expression Mason had seen all night. Worse than Rohr's dead-eyed calm, worse than Cole's invisible judicial corruption, Because it was warm, genuine. The practiced warmth of a man who had built a career on making the destruction of families look like compassion. I came here to offer you a way out, Voss said. Every man in this room is looking at felony obstruction charges by sunrise. You know that. I know that. You've got a county court order you're defying, 3 law enforcement units outside, and a social worker who's having a breakdown in booth 14. He glanced at Geller without interest. Whatever file your intelligence officer has compiled, it won't matter if you're all in handcuffs when the marshals arrive. The marshals aren't coming, Mason said. Something crossed Voss's face. Brief. Controlled. The micro-expression of a man recalculating an equation that just produced an unexpected variable. No? No. Voss studied him. The assessment was visible, and a scanning, measuring evaluation that took in Mason's posture, his breathing, his hands, his eyes, and the particular quality of his calm, which was not the calm of a man bluffing, but the calm of a man who had stopped being afraid because there was nothing left to fear. You've contacted the state police, Voss said. Not a question. Mason said nothing. Sergeant Colvin, I presume. He's been sniffing around my books for a year. Never found anything because there's nothing to find. My facilities are licensed, inspected, and compliant. Every placement is documented. Every child is accounted for. Every child except Sarah Whitfield's twins. Voss's coffee cup paused an inch from his lips. Kaylee and Jacob Whitfield, Mason continued. He hadn't known the names until 20 minutes ago, when Geller had whispered them to Sky between sobs in booth 14. Placed through Summit Ridge in 2023. Your records show them transferred to an out-of-state affiliate facility in Ohio 14 months later. But the Ohio facility closed in 2024. State records show no forwarding placement, no transfer documentation, no current caseworker assignment. Mason stepped closer. Where are those kids, Voss? The diner was silent. Even the wind outside seemed to hold its breath. Voss set down his coffee. The Whitfield children were transferred through proper channels. If there's a paperwork gap, it's an administrative, where are they? I don't have that information readily. You placed them. You collected the fees. 2 children, 4.5 years old. Their mother died 8 months later in a parking lot outside the same motel where you helped roar trap Lena Harper. Where did those kids go? Voss's jaw tightened. For the first time all night, the composure cracked. Not dramatically, not visibly to anyone who wasn't looking for it, but Mason was looking. He was standing close enough to see the man's pupils dilate and the tendons in his neck cord tight, and the particular tension that settles across a person's face when they're deciding whether to maintain the performance or abandon it. This conversation is over, Voss said. It hasn't started. Voss reached for the file folder he'd placed on the counter. This folder contains placement records, licensing certifications, and financial audits for every child currently in Summit Ridge's care. I brought it as a gesture of transparency. You're welcome to review it. I'll pass it to Judge Hart. The name landed like a detonation. Voss's hand stopped on the folder. His face went still. Not calm, not composed, but frozen. The stillness of a man hearing a name he associates with a threat level he can't dismiss. Evelyn Hart, Voss said slowly. 15th Judicial Circuit. She's issuing a temporary restraining order against Rohr's custody claim as we speak. She's also ordering a state-level review of every family court action Judge Cole has signed in the last 5 years. Your placements, your finances, your transfers. Mason held his gaze. You're missing children. Voss stared at him for a long time. The diner hummed with the compressed attention of 74 men watching a confrontation that had moved beyond threats and into the territory where outcomes became irreversible. Then Voss picked up the folder, turned, and walked toward the door. He stopped 3 feet from it. You think you've won something, he said without turning around. You haven't. You've started something you can't finish. Judge Hart can issue whatever orders she wants. By the time her paperwork reaches this county, every file in my office will be clean, every witness will be managed, and every child in my system will be exactly where the documentation says they are. You've bought yourself a morning. I've been building this for 12 years. He opened the door. Cold air rushed in. He stepped out. And that's when the siren started. Not from the cruisers, from the highway. A single state police vehicle, lights flashing blue and red through the thinning snow, coming fast from the northeast on Route 19. Behind it, a second vehicle. Behind that, A third. A convoy of state units screaming down the highway at a speed that said this was not a routine response. This was a deployment. Voss stopped in the parking lot. He turned toward the approaching lights. The sirens grew louder, reflecting off the snow in the diner windows, and the chrome of 74 Harleys still parked in formation. The first state police cruiser pulled into the lot, and 2 troopers stepped out. The second blocked the exit where Rohr's unit sat. The third parked directly behind Voss's SUV, and from the first cruiser's passenger side, a woman stepped out. She was perhaps 60, slim, wearing a dark wool coat over what appeared to be hastily assembled court attire. Her silver hair was pulled back severely. Her face was angular and hard in the way faces become hard when they've spent decades in rooms where weak people do harmful things, and someone has to be the one who says no. She carried a leather briefcase, and she walked across the parking lot with the measured stride of a person who treated urgency as a discipline rather than a panic. Judge Evelyn Hart. Behind her, Tank climbed off his Harley. His face was raw from wind and cold, his beard iced, his eyes red-rimmed from 47 miles of frozen highway. Griggs and Boone flanked him, equally destroyed, equally upright. Tank looked at Mason through the diner window and nodded once. Hart stopped in front of Voss. She was a foot shorter than him, but the differential was irrelevant. She occupied space the way authority occupies space, which has nothing to do with physical dimensions and everything to do with the certainty that the ground you're standing on belongs to you. "Mr. Voss," she said. Her voice carried through the cold air clearly enough that Mason could hear it from the doorway. "I have a temporary restraining order issued under the authority of the 15th Judicial Circuit, State of West Virginia, enjoining Braxton County from executing any custody transfer involving the minor child, Eli Harper. I also have an emergency hold on all family court orders signed by Judge Marcus Cole in the last 36 months. And I have a preservation order directing you, Summit Ridge Youth Services, and the Braxton County Department of Social Services to retain all records, communications, and financial documents pending a full state-level investigation." She opened her briefcase, removed 3 sets of documents, and held them out. "You're being served." Voss didn't take the papers. He stared at Hart with the expression of a man who had built a kingdom out of institutional leverage and was watching the institution turn against him in real time. "This will be challenged," he said. "It will be. And it will hold, because I don't issue orders I can't defend, Mr. Voss. Unlike some of your judicial associates." A state trooper stepped forward and placed the documents in Voss's hands. The man stood in the parking lot holding papers that represented the first crack in 12 years of constructed impunity, and the snow fell on his silver hair, and the flashing lights painted his face in alternating blue and red, and he looked, for the first time, like what he was. Not a provider, not a businessman, not a savior of children, a man exposed. Hart turned and walked into the diner. She stopped inside the doorway and surveyed the room. The bikers, the counter, the sleeping boy in booth 9. Her gaze moved across everything with the practiced efficiency of someone who had spent a career evaluating chaos and extracting the essential facts. "Mr. Vale?" "That's me." "Your associate provided compelling preliminary evidence during our call. I'll need the complete file from your intelligence officer, sworn statements from anyone willing to testify, and the cooperation of—" Her eyes found Geller in booth 14, the county social worker. "She's willing," Mason said. Hart nodded. She looked at Eli. Something in her expression shifted, not softened, exactly, but deepened. The look of a woman who had seen too many children processed through systems that were supposed to protect them and had developed the particular fury that comes from knowing exactly how often those systems fail. "The child stays here until I can arrange a verified emergency guardian through the state system," Hart said. "Sergeant Colvin's unit will maintain presence. Aurora is being detained as we speak for questioning regarding the fabricated custody filing." Mason exhaled for what felt like the first time in hours. "It's not over," Hart said, reading his expression with the accuracy of someone who'd spent decades telling people things they didn't want to hear. "Voss will lawyer up by breakfast. Cole will claim judicial independence. The Foster Network will scramble to clean its records. What you've started tonight is a fuse, Mr. Vale. It will burn, but it will take months, maybe longer." "And the boy?" Hart looked at Eli again. "The boy is safe, for now. That's what this morning is about." She moved past Mason toward Sky's laptop, and the two women began speaking in low, precise voices. Law and evidence and procedure, the architecture of accountability built one document at a time. Mason walked to the diner door and stepped outside. The snow had slowed to scattered flakes drifting through the early gray light that comes before dawn in West Virginia. Not yet sunrise, but the promise of it. The sky shifting from black to the deep bruised blue that means the night is losing its grip. State troopers moved through the parking lot with quiet efficiency. Two of Rohr's cruisers were gone, pulled out when the state units arrived, deputies suddenly finding other places to be. The third cruiser sat empty, its driver having walked away at some point during Hart's arrival without anyone noticing or caring. Voss's SUV was still there. Voss was not. He'd gotten into a second vehicle, a gray sedan that appeared from the side road, and disappeared north while the troopers were focused on the diner. Mason had watched him go. Let him go. The man could run, but the documents couldn't be unfiled, and the judge couldn't be unawakened, and the fuse Hart described couldn't be unlit. Tank stood by his Harley. He looked like a man who'd ridden through the apocalypse and come back with a receipt. Ice hung from his beard. His gloves were cracked. His eyes were bloodshot and raw and burning with something that exhaustion couldn't touch. "You look terrible," Mason said. 47 miles at 15 miles an hour in a blizzard. Griggs went down twice. Boone's front tire blew outside Huttonsville. We rode the last 8 miles on a rim. On a rim. On a rim. Mason stared at him. Tank stared back. And then something happened that neither man had experienced in so long they'd both forgotten what it felt like. They laughed. Not loud. Not long. The short, broken, exhausted laughter of two men who'd been awake for 30 hours and had just survived something they'd process for the rest of their lives. It lasted maybe 5 seconds. Then it was gone, replaced by the cold and the silence and the weight of everything still unresolved. "How's the kid?" Tank asked. "Sleeping. Hart's handling the legal side. Colvin's people are processing the scene." "And Lena?" Mason's jaw tightened. He'd been thinking about it since Hart arrived. The hospital, the ICU, Rohr's proximity to a woman too sick to protect herself. Hart sent a trooper to County General with the restraining order, but Rohr was at the hospital before anyone thought to cover it. "You think he got to her?" "I think a man who's been controlling a woman for years doesn't stop because the first patrol car shows up." Tank looked toward the highway. The sky was brightening. Somewhere east, behind layers of cloud and dissipating storm, the sun was preparing to rise on a day that would change everything about Black Creek, West Virginia. "Go," Tank said. Mason looked at him. "I'll stay with the boy. Sky's got the file. Hart's got the law. Go to that hospital, Mason. Go see about Caleb's wife." Mason reached for his keys. His hand was shaking. Not from cold, from something deeper. The tremor of a man standing at the edge of the thing he'd been running from for 6 years and finally stopping. He walked to his Harley, threw his leg over the seat. The engine fired with a sound that split the quiet morning like a declaration. He pulled out of the lot and turned east on Route 19, riding toward a hospital where a woman he'd failed was fighting to survive, where a deputy he'd exposed might have already done damage he couldn't undo. The road was ice and salt and broken asphalt. The sky was the color of bruises fading, and somewhere in the ICU at County General, a monitor beeped in the steady rhythm of a heart that refused to stop. Lena Harper's heart, beating in a body that had been beaten and medicated and isolated and abandoned but was still, against every odd and every force arranged against it, alive. Mason rode toward it, 40 miles of frozen highway, and he didn't know, couldn't know, that 30 minutes before Hart's restraining order reached the hospital, Deputy Warren Rohr had walked into the ICU, closed the curtain around Lena Harper's bed, and leaned down close enough for only her to hear. What he whispered made her scream, and by the time the nurses reached her, Rohr was already gone, badge on his hip, smile on his face, walking through the hospital lobby and out into the snow as if nothing in the world had ever been wrong. Mason heard the scream before he reached the ICU, not through walls, through memory. The charge nurse met him at the third-floor elevator with a face that looked like it had been holding together by discipline alone and was one more incident away from structural failure. Her name tag read Carver, the same nurse who'd called the diner. She was holding a clipboard against her chest like a shield. "He was here," Carver said. No preamble, no professional buffer, just the raw, exhausted statement of a woman who'd been fighting a system from inside it for longer than anyone should have to. Roar, he came through the staff entrance at 4:50 a.m. We were between shift rotations. Security was covering the ER because of storm-related admissions. He had his badge and his court order, and he walked past the desk like he belonged here. What did he do? He closed her curtain. He was with her for maybe 90 seconds. Then we heard her scream, and by the time I pulled the curtain back, he was already walking out, calm, smiling, like nothing happened. Mason's vision narrowed. The fluorescent hallway lights became a tunnel. His hands curled into fists at his sides, the knuckles cracking with the dry, mechanical sound of a man's body preparing for something his mind hadn't authorized yet. What did he say to her? She won't tell us. She won't talk at all. She's been staring at the wall since it happened. Blood pressure spiked. Heart rate hit 140. We had to sedate her to stabilize the pneumonia treatment. Carver paused, looked at Mason with the directness of someone who had stopped caring about protocol somewhere around hour 11 of her shift. Whatever he said, it broke something in her that the fever hadn't reached yet. Mason walked past the nurse's station. 2 state troopers stood at the end of the hall. They'd arrived 12 minutes before Mason, Hart's restraining order in hand, and had locked down the ICU entrance. Too late. The horse was already out. The troopers looked at Mason's leather cut and his expression and stepped aside without asking for identification because whatever they saw on his face made credentials irrelevant. Room 7. Glass partition, blue-gray light from monitors, the mechanical rhythm of a ventilator assisting breathing that should have been autonomous. And Lena Harper, propped at a 30-degree angle in a hospital bed with tubes in her arms and oxygen in her nose, and a face turned toward the wall that Mason could only see in profile. Hollow, ashen, the face of a woman who had survived the night but wasn't sure she wanted to survive the morning. He pulled a chair to the bedside. The legs scraped against the floor, and Lena flinched. A full-body contraction, shoulders curling inward, hands gripping the blanket, the conditioned response of a body that had learned to associate nearby sounds with incoming pain. Lena. Mason kept his voice low. It's Mason Vale. She didn't turn, didn't move. Her eyes stayed fixed on the wall as if the wall was the only thing in the room that hadn't hurt her. Eli's safe, Mason said. He's at the diner with my people. Judge Hart issued a restraining order. State police are on site. Aurora can't touch him. A tear slid down the side of Lena's face that was visible. It traced the curve of her cheekbone and dropped onto the pillow without sound. He said he already moved Eli. Her voice was barely there. Broken glass and whispered air. He leaned down and told me he'd already taken Eli out of the diner and placed him in a Summit Ridge home and that I'd never see him again. He said I could fight it, or I could sign the papers he left under my pillow and keep visitation rights. Once a month. Supervised. Mason's jaw locked so hard his teeth creaked. Is it true? She asked, still facing the wall. Did he take him? No. Eli's asleep in a booth at Rustline Diner wrapped in a blanket with 74 bikers watching over him. Nobody took him. Nobody's going to take him. Lena turned her head. Slowly, as if the motion cost her something she couldn't afford. She looked at Mason for the first time, and what he saw in her eyes was worse than fear, worse than pain, worse than the years of accumulated damage that had reduced Caleb Harper's sharp-witted, stubborn wife to a woman in a motel room with empty medicine bottles. What he saw was the very last thread of hope being tested. You swear, she said. I swear. Caleb said you were a man who kept promises. The sentence hit Mason in a place that had no armor. He looked at his hands, scarred, incomplete, the missing fingertip a permanent reminder of things lost through carelessness. And he felt the full weight of 6 years of avoidance settle onto his shoulders with a gravity that was almost physical. Caleb had said that. In that hospital room, with his voice failing and his liver shutting down and his eyes already losing focus on a world he was leaving. Mason's the kind of man who keeps his word, Lena. He'll take care of you. He promised. Caleb was wrong about me, Mason said. But he's not going to be wrong about this. He reached under her pillow, found the papers Roar had left. A consent form, pre-filled, Lena's name already typed on the signature line. The legal instrument that would have ended her motherhood with a pen stroke extracted through terror from a woman too sick to fight. Mason held the papers in front of her so she could see them. Then he tore them in half. Then in quarters. Then he walked to the small bathroom beside her bed and flushed them, while the toilet's mechanical gurgle sounded like the most satisfying thing he'd heard in 30 hours. When he came back, Lena was crying. Not the silent, controlled tears of before, real crying, deep and ragged, the ugly kind that comes from a place below language where grief and relief live in the same room and can't be separated. Her shoulders shook, her IV line trembled. The monitor beeped faster and then slower as her body processed something that medication couldn't manage and machinery couldn't measure. Mason sat in the chair and didn't touch her and didn't speak and didn't leave. He just sat there while she cried because sometimes that was the only thing a person needed from another person. Not words, not solutions, not the performance of comfort, but the simple, stubborn presence of someone who wasn't going anywhere. After a while, the crying stopped. Lena's breathing evened, her eyes closed. The sedation pulled her back toward sleep, but before she went, her hand moved across the blanket and found Mason's hand on the bed rail. "Bring me my son," she whispered, "soon as you're strong enough to hold him." She slept. Mason sat for 11 more minutes. He watched the monitors count her heartbeats and her oxygen levels, and all the numerical evidence that a body was still fighting even when the person inside it had been given every reason to stop. Then he stood, walked to the nurse's station, and spoke to Carver in a voice that carried no aggression and no negotiation. "Nobody enters that room without a state trooper present, not hospital staff, not county personnel, not anyone with a badge from Braxton County. If Rohr or anyone connected to him comes within 100 feet of this floor, you call Sergeant Colvin directly." He wrote the number on the back of a prescription pad. "Can you do that?" "I've been doing that for 3 years," Carver said. "You're just the first person who asked." Mason rode back to Black Creek as dawn broke over the mountains. The storm was over. Not finished. Storms don't finish, they just lose their grip. But the snow had stopped, and the clouds were thinning, and pale light leaked through the gaps like a wound trying to heal. Route 19 was being plowed by a single county truck moving east with its orange lights rotating. The asphalt was wet and salted and gleaming. The world looked exhausted, cleaned, the way a place looks after it has been through something that stripped it down to its essential parts. Rustline Diner sat in the weak morning light like something that had survived a siege. State police vehicles flanked the lot. Harleys still lined the east side in formation, their chrome dulled by melted snow, their engines cold. Smoke rose from the kitchen vent. The yellow neon sign was off. Someone had finally turned it off, or the power had finally quit, or Donna had simply decided that the night was over and the sign could rest. Mason parked, killed the engine, sat on his bike for a moment in the silence that follows when you've been awake for 32 hours, and the adrenaline has burned off, and the world is just the world again. Cold, flawed, turning slowly toward morning. He walked inside. The diner smelled like coffee and bacon, and the particular warmth of a room that had been full of human bodies all night. Most of the bikers were awake, scattered across booths with plates of food Donna had been producing from a kitchen that should have run out of supplies hours ago, but somehow hadn't. Eggs, toast, hash browns, sausage, the breakfast of aftermath. Men ate without speaking, forks scraped, coffee steamed. The silence wasn't tense anymore. It was the silence of people who had been through something together and didn't need to narrate it. Skye sat at the counter with her laptop closed and a cup of tea between her hands. She looked up when Mason walked in, and the exhaustion on her face was total, eyes hollow, skin tight, the wrung-out pallor of a woman who had spent the night building a legal case from a diner counter using a satellite phone and a cached database. But beneath the exhaustion, something else. Satisfaction. The quiet, fierce satisfaction of a soldier who had completed a mission without firing a shot. "Colvin called 20 minutes ago," she said. "Rohr's been placed on administrative leave pending investigation. Sheriff Braddock issued a statement distancing the department from Rohr's actions, which tells you exactly how fast that ship is sinking when even the man who enabled it starts swimming for shore. Judge Cole's office has been sealed by state order, and Hart has requested a full audit of Summit Ridge's placement records going back 5 years. Voss? Still missing. His office in Charleston was cleaned out by the time state investigators arrived. But his financial accounts have been frozen, his foster care licenses have been suspended, and Colvin says the FBI's Public Corruption Unit has opened a preliminary inquiry based on the interstate transfer records." Skye paused. "The Whitfield twins, Kaylee and Jacob. Colvin's team found a record buried in Voss's archived server files. The children were transferred to a facility in Ohio that closed, but there's a secondary transfer document pointing to a group home in Kentucky that's still operational. Colvin has a unit heading there this morning. Mason closed his eyes. 2 children. 4 years old when they disappeared. 6 now, if the math was right. Alive somewhere in Kentucky, in a system that had swallowed them and digested their identities and redistributed them across state lines like inventory, but alive, findable. Because a 6-year-old boy walked into a diner with $1.37 and asked for soup. "Where's the boy?" Mason asked. Sky tilted her head toward booth 9. Eli was awake. He sat cross-legged on the vinyl seat with the wool blanket around his shoulders and a plate of scrambled eggs in front of him that he was eating with the careful, methodical attention of a child who had learned not to waste food. Tank sat across from him. The two of them, the 6-year-old and the massive, ice-bearded sergeant-at-arms, who'd ridden 47 miles through a blizzard on a motorcycle, were engaged in a conversation that Mason couldn't hear from across the room but could read in their body language. Tank was showing Eli something on his phone. The boy was leaning forward to look. Tank's face, which had been hewn from granite and bad weather for as long as Mason had known him, was doing something Mason had never seen it do. It was soft. Not smiling, not performing, just soft. The unguarded expression of a man who had lost custody of his own daughter and was sitting across from someone else's son and feeling something that all the distance and whiskey and highway miles in the world hadn't managed to kill. Mason walked to the booth. Eli looked up. Those 2 old eyes studied him, and then something happened in them that Mason would carry for the rest of his life. They brightened. Not dramatically, not the way eyes brighten in stories, just a small, real shift. The micro-expression of a child recognizing someone who came back when they said they would. "You came back," Eli said. "Told you I would." "You saw my mom?" "I saw her. She's getting better. She told me to bring you to her as soon as she's strong enough." Eli processed this with the careful deliberation of someone who'd learned to evaluate adult statements for reliability before investing emotional currency in them. He looked at Tank. Tank nodded. The boy looked back at Mason. "Is the bad man gone?" Mason crouched beside the booth, eye level. "The bad man is gone. There are people making sure he stays gone. Serious people. The kind who don't stop." "Like you? Better than me? But yeah, like us." Eli picked up his fork and ate another bite of eggs. Then he set the fork down and reached into the pocket of his hoodie and pulled out something small and held it in his open palm. The coins. The crumpled dollar bill and the scatter of change. $1.37. "I want to pay for the soup," Eli said. "Kid, the soup's on me. I told you that." "Not for my soup." The boy looked across the diner at the counter where Donna was pouring coffee for a trooper. "For the next kid, in case another kid comes in and they're hungry and they only have a little bit of money. I want to leave this here so they know it's okay." Mason stared at the coins in the boy's palm. He felt Tank go still across the table. He felt the room shift around him. Not physically, but emotionally, the way a room shifts when something true is said, and everyone in it recognizes it. Eli climbed out of the booth and walked to the counter with his blanket trailing behind him like a cape. He stood on his toes and carefully placed the dollar and the coins on the surface, arranging them in a neat row the way a child arranges things that matter. "Not for me," he said to Donna. "For the next kid." Donna looked at the money, looked at the boy. Her cracked, weathered hands came up and covered her mouth, and her eyes filled, and she stood there behind the counter of a diner that had seen 30 years of hard luck and bad coffee, and never once, not once, anything like this. Nobody in the room moved. Then Decker stood up from his booth. He walked to the counter and pulled a 20 from his wallet and set it beside Eli's coins. He didn't say anything, just put it down and stepped back. Griggs followed. A 50. Then Boone, then Harker, then a prospect whose name Mason didn't know. Then another, and another. Men stood from booths and stools and walked to the counter and placed bills beside a child's coins without ceremony, without performance, without the self-conscious theater that generosity sometimes becomes when it's done for show. This wasn't for show. This was 74 men responding to a 6-year-old's instinct to protect someone he'd never met, with money he couldn't afford to give, and recognizing in that instinct something they'd been riding toward their entire lives without knowing it. The pile grew. Donna started crying. Skye typed something into her laptop. Later, Mason would learn she'd opened a trust account in Eli's name before the morning was over, funded by the Iron Sentinel's chapter treasury. But in the moment, all that existed was the counter and the coins and the money and the boy standing in front of it all with his hospital blanket and his two old eyes watching men he didn't know do something he hadn't asked for. Mason put down the last bill, $500, every dollar of cash he had on him. He set it on the pile and looked at Eli and said nothing because the moment didn't need his voice. It needed his presence. And for the first time in 6 years, his presence was exactly where it was supposed to be. The morning settled. State troopers came and went. Hart's office called 3 times. Updates on the investigation, on Cole's suspension, on the preliminary findings from Summit Ridge's records that were already painting a picture ugly enough to make national news. Geller was transported to the state police barracks in Elkins to give her formal statement. She went without protest. She went, Mason thought, with something that might have been relief. The unburdening of a woman who had been carrying 9 years of complicity like a stone in her chest and was finally allowed to set it down. By 10 a.m., the first Harleys started leaving. Not all at once. Not in formation. In 1s and 2s and 3s, the way men leave when the job is done and the road is calling and the bonds that held them in place have loosened enough to let them return to whatever versions of their lives waited on the other side of the night. They rolled out of the parking lot and turned onto Route 19, and their engines faded into the distance the way thunder fades, slowly, reluctantly, leaving a silence that remembers the sound. Griggs left at 10:15. He stopped beside Eli's booth and crouched down and said something that made the boy almost smile. Then he pulled on his helmet and walked out, and Mason watched through the window as his taillight disappeared south. Boone left at 10:30. He shook Mason's hand with a grip that said everything his mouth didn't. Decker left at 10:47. He stopped at the door and turned back and looked at Mason with an expression that was different from the righteous anger of the night before, older somehow, quieter. The look of a 23 who'd walked into a diner as a prospect and was walking out as something else. "You were right," Decker said, "about the witnesses." "You were right too," Mason said, "about the math." Decker almost smiled. Then he was gone. By noon, only 5 sentinels remained. Mason, Tank, Skye, and 2 road captains named Ellis and Brennan who'd quietly taken over perimeter watch and refused to leave until every state unit was in position. The diner was nearly empty. Donna had stopped cooking and was sitting in a booth with her shoes off and her feet up, and the deep, boneless exhaustion of a woman who had served more food in one night than she normally served in a week. Tank sat in his corner booth with his phone in his hand, staring at the screen. Mason walked over. On the screen was a photograph. A girl, maybe 8, with Tank's eyes and her mother's hair, wearing a soccer uniform and smiling the enormous, uninhibited smile of a child who didn't know her father was looking at her picture in a diner in West Virginia at noon on a Tuesday. "She's beautiful," Mason said. Tank put the phone away. "She doesn't know who I am." "She will." "You don't know that." "No, but I know you rode 47 miles on ice for somebody else's kid. A man who does that deserves to know his own." Tank looked at him for a long time. The granite face did its work, absorbing, processing, filing the statement in whatever internal architecture Tank used to manage the unbearable weight of things he couldn't change. Then he nodded, once, and stood. "I'm riding south," Tank said. "Virginia? Her mother's in Roanoke. Maybe I'll stop. Maybe I'll just ride past. Either way, I'm going." "Either way," Mason said. "You're going." Tank left. His Harley's engine was the loudest thing in Black Creek for 30 seconds. Then it was gone. At 2:15 p.m., Nurse Carver called. Lena was awake, stable, asking for Eli. Mason drove the boy to County General in a borrowed truck from Donna's garage, a 1998 Ford with a heater that worked intermittently and a radio that didn't work at all. Eli sat in the passenger seat with his blanket and his hospital wristband, and the window cracked an inch because he said he liked cold air on his face. The road was wet and clear. The sky was gray and softening. The mountains on either side of Route 19 stood in their ancient positions, indifferent to the human drama that had played out in their shadow, covered in snow that would melt by Thursday and be forgotten by the weekend. At the hospital, Mason walked Eli through corridors that smelled like antiseptic and institutional coffee. A state trooper checked their names at the ICU entrance. Carver met them with a wheelchair for Eli, which the boy refused because he wanted to walk. They stopped outside room 7. Through the glass partition, Lena was propped up in bed. Her color was better. Not good, not healthy, but the gray had lifted to something more human. Her eyes were open and fixed on the door with the intensity of a woman who had been listening for footsteps and had finally heard them. Mason crouched beside Eli. "You ready?" The boy looked through the glass at his mother. His small frame trembled. Not cold, not fear, but the physical overflow of an emotion too large for a 6-year-old body to contain. "She looks different," he said. "She's been sick, buddy, but she's getting better." "Will she stay better?" Mason thought about lying, about offering the easy comfort that adults give children when the truth is too complicated and the future is too uncertain, and the simplest kindness is a promise that might not hold. But Eli Harper was not a child who had been served by easy comfort. He was a child who'd walked through a blizzard and bought soup with his last dollar and checked his mother's breathing while she slept because the world had taught him that survival required accuracy, not hope. "I don't know," Mason said, "but there are people helping now, real people, and I'm going to be one of them." Eli looked at him, measured him, found whatever he was looking for. Then he pushed open the door and walked into the room. Lena saw him. Her face collapsed, not in grief, but in the total structural failure of every wall she'd built to survive the night, every defense mechanism that had kept her breathing when breathing was the hardest thing she'd ever done. Her arms opened. Her mouth formed his name, but no sound came out. And Eli crossed the room at a run, the first time Mason had seen the boy run since he walked into the diner 12 hours ago, and climbed onto the hospital bed and pressed his face against his mother's chest and held on. "Mom." His voice was muffled against her gown. "I came back." Lena's arms closed around him. She held him the way you hold something that was stolen and returned, with a grip that communicated not tenderness, but the absolute refusal to let go again. Her body shook. His body shook. The monitors beeped their indifferent data. The ventilator hissed its mechanical assistance. And in the blue-gray light of a hospital room in rural West Virginia, a mother and her son held each other with the ferocity of two people who had learned that the world would try to separate them and had decided, without words, that the world would have to try harder. Mason watched from the doorway. He didn't go in. This moment wasn't his. It belonged to them, to the woman and the boy and the absent presence of Caleb Harper, who had died in a room exactly like this one and whose last wish was being fulfilled 6 years too late by a man who didn't deserve credit for it. He stepped back, let the door close, stood in the hallway with his hands in his jacket pockets and the fluorescent lights buzzing above him, and the particular emptiness that comes after purpose has been fulfilled, and you're left standing in the space where urgency used to be. Carver appeared beside him. "You should eat something." "I should do a lot of things." "Start with food." He almost laughed. He drove back to Black Creek at 4 p.m. The diner was closed. Donna had finally locked the door and gone home. A note taped to the glass read, "Reopening Thursday," with no further explanation, as if the events of the past 18 hours could be covered by a 2-day intermission and a fresh pot of coffee. The parking lot was empty except for Sky's Harley and Mason's borrowed truck. He found her inside. Donna had left the door unlocked for them, sitting at the counter with her laptop open and 2 cups of coffee, one for her and one already poured for him. "Hart called," Sky said. "Final update for today. Roar's been arrested. Not administrative leave, arrested. State police picked him up at a gas station in Summersville trying to get on I-79. Charges are pending, but Colvin says they're looking at falsifying legal documents, abuse of authority, conspiracy to defraud the state foster care system, and witness intimidation. The FBI's corruption unit is coordinating." Cole? Suspended from the bench. Judicial Review Board convened an emergency session. His sealed cases are being unsealed by Hart's order. Every family court action he's touched in the last 5 years is under review. Boss? Still in the wind, but his accounts are frozen, his licenses are pulled, and every facility in his network is being inspected by state teams this week. The children currently in Summit Ridge homes are being assessed for proper placement. And the Whitfield twins? Skye paused. Her professional composure wavered for a fraction of a second. Kaylee and Jacob Whitfield were located at a group home in eastern Kentucky at 11:40 this morning. They're alive. They're being transferred to state care pending family reunification. Their aunt in Morgantown has been contacted. Mason drank his coffee. It was terrible. Burnt, hours old, the last dregs of a pot that Donna had made before sunrise. It was the best coffee he'd ever tasted. What about Geller? He asked. Cooperating fully. Hart's office is working on an immunity arrangement in exchange for testimony. She's naming everyone. Rohr, Cole, Voss, the foster families who participated knowingly, the state reviewer who falsified licensing inspections. It's a thread, Mason, and it's unraveling the whole cloth. Skye closed her laptop. She wrapped both hands around her coffee and looked at the counter where Eli's coins and the pile of bills had sat that morning. Donna had collected the money and put it in the register with a note that Skye had photographed for the trust account records. The counter was clean now, empty. But both of them could still see it, the dollar and the 37 cents and the small hands that had placed them there. What happens to them? Skye asked. Lena and Eli. After the investigation, after the trials, after all of this. I'm going to find out. That sounds like a plan that extends beyond tonight. It does. Skye looked at him. The operational mask was gone. What was underneath was tired, human, and more transparent than she usually allowed herself to be in anyone's presence. Good, she said. Caleb would have said good. She finished her coffee, stood, pulled on her jacket and her gloves and her helmet with the practiced efficiency of a woman who'd been leaving places her whole life and had made peace with the motion of it. She stopped at the door. You know, this doesn't fix everything, she said. The system Voss built took 12 years to construct. It'll take years to prosecute. Some of those kids may never be found. Some of those families may never recover. And Mason Vale sitting in a hospital room doesn't undo 6 years of not sitting in a hospital room. I know. As long as you know. She left. Her engine fired outside and the sound was a single note in the empty parking lot, clear and sharp and final. Then it faded. Then it was gone. Mason sat alone in Russline Diner. The overhead lights were off. The only illumination came from the neon vacancy sign of the Sunrise Motel bleeding through the east-facing windows. Red, then dark, then red again. The same broken rhythm it had pulsed all night. The counter was clean. The booths were empty. The floor still showed the faint marks of 100 boots and one pair of soaked children's sneakers. He sat in booth 9, where Eli had slept. The vinyl was still warm from the boy's body heat, or maybe that was Mason's imagination. The phantom warmth of something precious that had been there and was gone, and had left its impression on a surface that would never quite return to what it was before. He put his hands on the table. Scarred hands. Incomplete hands. The hands of a man who had broken things and failed people, and spent 6 years proving that grief was easier to carry than love. Those hands had held a boy's soup money, and a dying woman's fingers, and a set of forged papers he'd flushed down a hospital toilet. Those hands had not thrown a single punch all night. Not because the violence wasn't there. It was always there. It would always be there, humming in the wire of his nervous system like a frequency that never fully tuned out. But because the violence wasn't what was needed. What was needed was the other thing, the harder thing, the standing still, the staying put, the being present in a room where a child was scared and a woman was dying, and the only useful response was to not leave. He hadn't left. Mason Vale sat in booth 9 of Russline Diner in Black Creek, West Virginia, at 4:30 in the afternoon on a Tuesday in February, and let the silence settle around him like snowfall. Outside, the plows were clearing Route 19. The sun was somewhere behind the mountains, already going down, painting the clouds in colors that nobody was around to name. The Harleys were gone. The troopers were gone. The storm was gone. But the coins were still on the counter. The trust was still in the bank. The twins were still alive in Kentucky. And a boy in a hospital bed was still holding his mother with the grip of someone who had learned in the space of a single night that letting go wasn't the only option. Mason pulled out his phone. Signal was back. He stared at the screen for a long time. Then he opened his contacts and scrolled to a name he hadn't called in 6 years. Harper, Lena. The number was probably disconnected. The number was probably wrong. The number was a relic of a life he'd walked away from because walking was what he did best. He pressed call. It rang 4 times. 5. 6. Hello? Lena's voice. Weak. Medicated. Alive. It's Mason. I'm calling to ask what Eli likes for breakfast, because I'm going to bring it to that hospital tomorrow morning, and the morning after that, and the morning after that until you're strong enough to make it yourself. Silence on the line. The kind of silence that isn't empty, but full of 6 years and a dead man's wish, and the first tentative, terrified evidence that a broken promise could still, if you held it carefully enough, be set. Pancakes, Lena said. He likes pancakes. Then pancakes it is. Mason hung up. He stood. He walked to the door and opened it and stepped into the cold February air of a town that had been through something it would talk about for years without ever fully understanding. His Harley waited in the parking lot, chrome dull, engine cold, patient as a horse that knows the way home. He threw his leg over the seat, turned the key. The engine caught on the first try, and the sound filled the empty lot with thunder that bounced off the diner walls, and the motel facade and the plowed asphalt of Route 19 and faded into the mountains. He rode east toward the hospital, toward morning, toward pancakes and a promise he was going to keep this time if it killed him. The road was cold and clear and his. And in the emotional protector biker universe, that was enough. Not redemption, not forgiveness, not the clean Hollywood ending where the music swells and the credits roll and everyone goes home healed. Just a man on a motorcycle riding toward a child who needed breakfast and a woman who needed someone to stay. Just the road, just the ride, just enough.